There are hundreds of secrets buried in Elden Ring that most players walk right past, and this video is going to take you through all of them, one by one, in a way that's easy to just sit back and absorb. I put this together because I spent a genuinely embarrassing amount of hours in the lands between, just poking around in corners, reading item descriptions, and cross-referencing things that didn't quite add up. At some point I had so many notes that it made more sense to turn it into something. The choice I made when assembling this was to focus on the details that feel intentional, the ones that suggest From Software planted something there on purpose, rather than just listing visual glitches or out-of-bounds discoveries. I also reordered a few sections so that the bigger, more unsettling secrets come later, once you've already settled in. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Let's start at the very beginning, with the tutorial cave. Most players remember it as the place where they got killed by the giant crab or the grafted scion, depending on how confident they were feeling. But there's something in that cave that a lot of people don't notice until their second or third playthrough. The message on the ground that reads, "Ahead, therefore be aware of surroundings," is not just a hint. If you look at the wording carefully, it mirrors almost exactly the phrasing used by messages left in the world by characters who are trying to help you without revealing too much. The implication, and this is one reading among several, is that someone was in that cave before you, someone who knew what was coming, and whoever left that message didn't make it out. The cave itself has a layout that suggests it was once a place of burial. The shallow water, the low ceilings, the way the torches are positioned not to guide you forward, but almost to mark specific spots on the ground. If you stand still for a moment and look at the torchlight patterns, they don't lead toward the exit. They point inward, toward the walls, which is unusual for a tutorial space that's supposed to funnel you in one direction. One possible reading is that the cave was used as a tomb long before it became the starting point for Tarnished, who wash up on the shore. There's also the matter of the broken architecture near the water's edge. The stonework doesn't match the ruins you find later in Limgrave. It's older, rougher, and the carvings on the walls, barely visible unless you're looking for them, don't depict the Erd tree or the Golden Order at all. They show something circular, something that some players have described as resembling the Elden Ring itself, or possibly the moon, which starts to feel relevant once you learn more about Ranni and what she was working toward long before you ever arrived. Moving into Limgrave proper, one of the most commonly discussed Easter eggs is the invisible scarab paths. Scarabs, the little dung beetle-looking creatures that drop runes or ashes of war when you kill them, often travel in patterns that aren't random. If you follow one long enough without attacking it, you'll notice that its path almost always leads to something. A cliff edge with a message nearby, a crumbling wall that hides a cave entrance, a grave marker that doesn't show up on the map. The game never tells you to follow them. It just places them in the world and trusts that some players will be curious enough to try. One specific scarab in Limgrave walks a loop that passes directly over a shallow grave near the cliffs east of the Church of Ella. The grave has no marker, no item, no NPC nearby to explain it. It's just a mound of dirt that someone clearly placed there deliberately. The scarab's route takes it over that spot every single time, without deviation. What that means is genuinely unclear. It could be a remnant from an earlier build of the game. It could be an intentional detail pointing toward a quest line that was cut before release. Or it could just be that the grave belongs to someone the scarab is mourning. That last one sounds sentimental, but given how much of this game is built around grief and remembrance, it doesn't feel like too much of a stretch. The Church of Ella itself deserves more attention than it usually gets. Most players use it as a resting point, a place to grab the crafting kit from Merchant Kayleigh and move on. But the church has a history that the game only hints at through the architecture and the items you find nearby. The building is clearly a place of worship, but it was not built for the Golden Order. The style of the stonework, The angle of the windows, the way the altar is positioned, all of it suggests a much older faith. Some players have pointed out that the proportions of the archways match ruins found in the region of Faramazula, which exists outside of normal time and space within the game's lore. If that connection holds up, it suggests the Church of Ella may have been built by, or at least influenced by, a civilization that predates the Erd Tree entirely. And when you consider that merchant Kale, who has clearly been around for a very long time, and who speaks to you with a kind of tired familiarity that implies he knows far more than he's letting on, chose that specific church to set up shop, it starts to feel less like a coincidence and more like a statement. Kale is sitting in the ruins of something old because he understands old things. He's waiting in a place where the original faith once lived, because whatever comes next, he wants to be near the source. Kale himself is one of the stranger presences in the early game. He sells you basic supplies, gives you the crafting kit, and if you exhaust his dialogue, he eventually tells you that he's searching for a great caravan of his people. He says it quietly, without drama, and then goes back to sitting there in the church as if he didn't just reveal that he's been alone for an indeterminate amount of time, separated from everyone he knows. There's a merchant's body found much later in the game, far from Limgrave, that carries an item description, suggesting the merchant class were once enslaved and had their voices sealed away as punishment. If Kale knows this history, and his dialogue suggests he does, then his cheerfulness starts to feel less like a personality trait, and more like a survival mechanism. The first time most players encounter a walking mausoleum, the giant tortoise-like structure, covered in skulls that wanders certain regions of the map. They usually react with pure confusion. The mausoleums are enormous, slow, and covered in skull-like protrusions that look decorative but serve a mechanical purpose. If you can get on top of one and knock the skulls off, the mausoleum will kneel down and allow you inside, where you can duplicate a remembrance. The game explains this mechanic simply enough. What it doesn't explain is why the mausoleums walk. The lore buried in item descriptions and NPC dialogue points toward the idea that the mausoleums are not structures placed in the world at fixed locations. They move because they're meant to move. They're carrying their contents from place to place, either to protect what's inside or because the act of moving is itself part of the ritual. One reading suggests they're searching for something, circling regions of the map the way a grieving person might return again and again to familiar places. The skulls that cover their legs are not trophies. They appear to be offerings left by people who wanted the mausoleum to carry something on their behalf. When you knock those skulls off, you're removing the prayers of people who are long dead. There's a detail inside the mausoleums that almost no one talks about: the ceiling. If you look up while you're inside, the interior surface is carved with patterns that repeat in a very specific sequence. Those patterns match, almost exactly, the carvings found on the Erd Tree's roots when you encounter them underground. This suggests a connection between whoever built the mausoleums and the Erd Tree itself, which is interesting because the Erd Tree is generally presented as a relatively recent addition to the lands between, at least in cosmological terms. If the mausoleums predate the Erd Tree but already incorporated its imagery, either the Erd Tree is older than the game implies, or the people who built the mausoleums had some kind of foreknowledge. Stormvale Castle has more hidden details per square foot than almost anywhere else in the game. One of the most frequently missed is the prisoner in the jail beneath the castle. You can find several prisoners locked in cages, and most of them are dead. But there's one cage tucked into a corner that requires you to take a path most players skip entirely, that contains a living prisoner. This prisoner doesn't speak. They just sit there, looking at you. They're not hostile. They don't react to you attacking them, except to flinch. And when you exhaust their presence without doing anything, they eventually stop looking at you and turn to face the wall. What makes this unsettling is not the prisoner themselves, but the cage. The cage is newer than the rest of the jail. The metal is less rusted, the lock is heavier, And there's a symbol on the door that appears elsewhere in the game, only on items connected to Godric the Grafted. The implication seems to be that Godric had this particular person locked up personally, not as a general prisoner of war, but as someone specific that he wanted contained. Who that person is, the game never says. There's no item on them, no dialogue, no name. They're just there, and then you leave, and that's all the game gives you. Godric himself is one of the more layered characters in the game, despite often being dismissed as a lesser antagonist. He's the first major boss most players encounter, and his introduction, the scene where he grafts a dragon's head onto his arm, is designed to read as grotesque and pathetic. But the lore around him suggests something more complicated. Godric is of the lineage of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, and he's been in a kind of decline for generations. The grafting is not just a power grab. The item descriptions around his questline point toward the idea that grafting was once a sacred practice, something done with ritual and intention, and that Godric is doing a broken, desperate version of something that once had genuine meaning. The castle itself was built by Godric's ancestors and then partially destroyed before being rebuilt in the diminished form you explore. If you look at the walls on the eastern side of the courtyard, you can see where the older construction ends and the newer work begins. The older stonework is clearly of higher quality, more precisely fitted, carved with motifs that the storm veil of Godric's era doesn't seem to understand anymore. He's living in the ruins of something that was built by people who are better at everything than he is. His grafting, his castle, his whole presentation is that of someone trying to recapture a greatness that he only knows through inheritance and memory. There's a ghost that appears in Stormvale that most players walk past without realizing it's there. Not a spirit ash, not a summon sign, just a translucent figure standing at a window on the upper floors of the castle. It appears only during a specific time of day within the game's cycle, and it's gone if you approach too quickly. It appears to be looking out over the courtyard toward the Erd Tree. It doesn't interact with you. It doesn't acknowledge you. It's just standing there, looking at something it can no longer reach. The Lands Between has a day and night cycle that most players stop thinking about after the first few hours, because it doesn't affect gameplay in obvious ways. But certain creatures, certain events, and certain visual details only appear or change at specific times of day. The ghost in Stormvale is one of them. The giant lobsters in Liurnia are more aggressive at night. Some messages on the ground only appear after dark. And there are locations where the lighting shifts enough to reveal engravings on walls that are completely invisible in daylight. From software built a functioning time system and then mostly left it for players to discover through aimless wandering and careful attention. Liurnia of the Lakes is one of the most visually distinctive regions in the game, a vast flooded lowland with crumbling ruins sticking up out of the water, and the Academy of Raya Lucaria sitting on what appears to be an island in the distance. The flooding is not natural. The lore suggests it was caused by a magical catastrophe connected to the Academy, which makes the ruins scattered throughout the water feel more poignant once you understand what happened. These aren't ancient structures submerged by geological change. They were buildings where people lived and worked, and the water came in fast enough that some of those people didn't make it out. If you dive into the water in certain sections of Liurnia, which the game allows you to do to a limited depth, before the invisible ceiling of the lake floor stops you, you can see details on the submerged ruins that aren't visible from above. Furniture is still in some of the rooms, doors are still on their hinges. There are items wedged between the stones that you can pick up if you're positioned correctly. The Academy is still producing graduates who walk out into this flooded world and act as if everything is fine, which is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. The institution survived its own catastrophe and just kept going. The Raya Lucaria Academy is where the game's magic system was developed and codified, and the architecture reflects the obsessiveness of that project. Every room in the Academy has some kind of diagram on the floor, or the ceiling, some theoretical framework for understanding how sorceries work. If you take the time to look at all of them, and not just run through to find the boss fog gate, you'll notice that they tell a story. The early diagrams are elegant and simple, basic geometric forms that suggest a clean initial theory. As you move deeper into the academy, the diagrams become more complex, more dense, more desperate looking. Whatever the founders understood clearly at the beginning, they stopped understanding it somewhere along the way and kept working anyway. The second to last room before the Renala boss fight has a diagram that breaks from the established visual grammar of all the others. Instead of geometric forms centered on a perfect axis, this one is asymmetrical, with a correction drawn over part of it in a different color ink. Someone came back to this diagram after it was completed and changed their mind about something important. What they changed their mind about is, like so many things in this game, not directly stated, but the correction points toward the section of the diagram that deals with the concept of rebirth, which is the exact power Renala uses in her second phase, and the exact service she provides to the player character afterward. Renala's boss fight is one of the most visually unusual in the game. The first phase takes place in a library while students carry her through the air, and she sits in a glowing orb while children's lullabies play in the background. It's designed to feel wrong in a way that's hard to articulate. The wrongness comes from the fact that what you're witnessing is a mental collapse, not an attack. Renala is not fighting you. She's retreated into a memory so completely that her presence in the room is almost accidental. The students carrying her are not guards. They're participating in a grief ritual that has gone on so long that no one remembers how it started. The lullabies playing during that fight are a specific detail worth sitting with. There are versions of Elden Ring's soundtrack that have been analysed closely enough to reveal that the lullabies are not original compositions for the game. They're arranged from an older musical tradition that From Software has used in previous games, modified to fit the Liurnia setting. If that's intentional, it suggests that the lands between shares some cultural substrate with the worlds of those other games, or at least that the music is meant to feel achingly familiar, like something you've heard before but can't quite place. That unplaceable familiarity is a specific emotional tool, and it's being used deliberately. Moving to the underground regions of the game, the Siofra River stands as one of the most technically impressive environments in Elden Ring, a massive subterranean space that contains an entire ancient civilization, a sky full of stars that have no business being underground, and creatures that predate almost everything you've encountered above ground. The stars in the Siofra River are not decorative. They were put there by someone who understood enough about astronomy to create an accurate representation of a night sky that no longer matches the one above the surface, which implies that the underground civilization was mapping the sky long before the surface world was reshaped into its current form. The ruins in Siofra are in better condition than most of what you find above ground. They're old, clearly, but they've been preserved by the underground environment in a way that stone exposed to the elements above never would be. If you spend time reading the architecture, looking at the proportions of the doorways and the spacing of the columns, it becomes clear that the people who built these structures were not the same people who built Stormvale or the Academy. The design philosophy is completely different. Everything is oriented toward the sky, toward the stars, toward something above, rather than outward or inward. They were watching something consistently for a very long time. There's a specific constellation visible in the Siofra River's underground sky that doesn't appear anywhere in the night sky above ground. It shows up on the map in a tiny, easy-to-miss location if you look at the corner of the in-game map for that region when fully explored. It's also drawn in the margins of a specific book found in the Academy of Raya Lucaria, which means someone in the Academy knew about the underground civilization and was actively studying it, which raises the question of what else they knew and chose not to document prominently. The Nokron Eternal City, which you reach after defeating Radan and watching a star fall from the sky and open a crater in Limgrave, is in some ways a continuation of the Siofra civilization, and in other ways something distinct. Nokron feels like a city that was flash-frozen at a specific moment, not destroyed gradually, but stopped suddenly, during what appears to have been a moment of great ceremony. The bodies of the residents are still in positions that suggest they were doing something specific when whatever happened, happened. They're not scattered, they're not hiding, they're arranged almost ritually, which either means the event was anticipated and the residents accepted it, or that whatever froze them in place was so instantaneous that the ceremony simply continued through death. The item you need to find in Nokron to continue Ranni's questline is the Finger Slayer blade, and the name is much more specific than it first appears. Fingers in the lore of Elden Ring are associated with the two fingers, the messengers of the greater will, the cosmic entity that placed the Elden Ring in the lands between and whose influence the Golden Order works to preserve. A blade designed to slay fingers is not a metaphor. It was made for a specific purpose, to kill or at least harm a specific kind of being, and the fact that it was found in a civilization that was apparently frozen at a moment of ceremony while living underground under a map of stars suggests that the people of Nokron were building towards something. They were preparing for a confrontation, or a ritual, or both. Ranni's questline is the longest and most elaborately hidden in the game, and almost every step of it contains details that most players miss, even when they are actively following a guide. One of those details is the doll in Ranni's Rise, the tower in Liurnia, where you first encounter her. The doll sitting on the chair is the doll Ranni currently inhabits, a body she chose for herself after abandoning her original flesh. If you look at the doll carefully, you can see that it's not commercially made. It's handcrafted. The stitching is visible, the proportions are slightly asymmetrical, and there are small symbols embroidered on the hem of its clothing that match the symbols associated with the Carian royal family. Someone made that doll specifically for Ranni, with intention and care, long before she chose to inhabit it. The leading theory among lore researchers is that Ranni made it herself, in preparation, which implies she planned her own death and resurrection, with enough lead time to craft the vessel she would need. The 3 witch fingers that were severed from Ranni's original body are a detail that connects to a much larger picture of how the greater will operates in the world. The 2 fingers communicate the will of a higher entity to the people of the lands between. Ranni's original body hosted miniature versions of this system, 3 fingers connected to a power that could have made her a vessel of that system. By having those fingers severed, which she arranged to happen on the night of the shattering when the Elden Ring broke and the demigods went to war, she disconnected herself from the system entirely. She made herself unreadable to the powers that be, and then she spent what appears to be an enormous amount of time putting into motion a plan that the greater will could not anticipate, because she was no longer broadcasting her intentions to anything that might report back. The Carian Manor, where Ranni's family maintained their power in Liurnia, is a place that rewards careful exploration in a way most people don't bother with, because the enemies there are annoying and the layout is confusing. The manor is built into the side of a cliffside, and the lower levels have been sealed off from the upper ones in a way that suggests a deliberate division rather than structural collapse. Something happened in the lower levels that the upper floors wanted no further contact with. If you find a way into those lower sections, and the game provides one if you look for it, you find evidence of magical experiments that don't match the aesthetic of the rest of the Carian work. The experiments in the lower levels are rougher, more urgent, and the materials used suggest they were working with substances that the Carian family publicly claimed to have no interest in. What those substances were is implied rather than stated, but the item descriptions of the things you find down there point toward Deathroot, which is the substance connected to the Black Knife assassins and to the concept of death being removed from the Elden Ring. If Ranni's family was secretly working with death in their basement while publicly maintaining their position as stargazing magicians separate from the Golden Order's politics, it reframes the entire Carian story. They weren't neutral, they were waiting, and they were preparing the tools they would need for a plan that had been in motion for far longer than anyone realized. The Black Knife assassins are one of the most mysterious factions in the game, elite killers who used blades imbued with the rune of death to assassinate Godwyn the Golden, one of Marika's children, in an event called the Night of the Black Knives. Godwyn's death was significant not just because he was beloved, but because of how he died. The rune of death that was stolen and used on that night was split in two, and one half was used on Godwyn while the other half was used on Ranni. Godwyn had his soul killed while his body lived. Ranni had her body killed while her soul lived. This was not an accident. The assassination was engineered to produce this specific result, and both victims were chosen deliberately. If you find and read the Black Knife armor set's item description, it mentions that the armor is made of a material that muffles sound completely, to the point where the wearers could move through a palace without making any noise at all. But there's a detail buried in that description that connects to a specific environmental Easter egg in Leyndell, the royal capital. In one of the upper rooms of the capital, there are scuff marks on the floor that match the pattern of movement you'd expect from multiple people moving in formation through a tight space. Those marks don't come from any enemy in that room. They were put there as evidence of something that happened before you arrived. The Black Knives passed through that room on the night of the assassination, and someone noticed and documented it in the architecture of the room itself. Leyndell, as a city, is extraordinary for how much history it contains in its visual design. The city has been built, destroyed, partially rebuilt, abandoned, reoccupied, and then buried under ash by the time you reach it. And you can read all of those layers if you're paying attention. The oldest parts of the city, visible in the foundations of certain buildings and in the road surface under the main thoroughfare, are built from a kind of stone that doesn't appear anywhere in the newer construction. That stone is associated in the item descriptions with the age of the Crucible, which is the era before the Eard Tree's current dominance, when life was more fluid and the distinctions between creatures were not as fixed as they later became. The Crucible Knights, who serve as enemies in multiple locations including Leyndell, are living remnants of that older era. Their armour is grown from their bodies rather than manufactured, and if you look closely at the design of their helmets and gauntlets, you can see that they're partially biological. The tail that extends from their backs is functional, not decorative. And the item descriptions for their talismans and ashes of war suggest that the powers they use, the fire breath, the tail sweep, the wing strikes, were considered holy in the age of the Crucible, because they reflected the unity of all life before the Erd Tree decided what shapes were acceptable and what shapes were not. There's a specific Crucible Knight that appears in a location you'd only find if you're exploring Leyndell's sewers, which most players do because they connect to a major underground area, but which most players move through as quickly as possible because the sewers are unpleasant. This Crucible Knight is alone in a room that appears to be a shrine of some kind. The room is decorated with motifs that don't match the Golden Order aesthetic of the city above. They match the older Crucible aesthetic, which means this room was either built before the current city was established over it, or someone maintained this space in secret, while the city above was practicing a different faith entirely. The Crucible Knight in that room is not aggressive unless you attack first, it's praying. You can interrupt it, or you can leave it alone. The game doesn't tell you which is the right choice. The Elden Beast, the final boss of the game, is generally understood to be the physical embodiment of the Elden Ring itself, a cosmic being sent by the Greater Will to inhabit the ring and give it form. What's less discussed is the visual design of the Elden Beast's arena, which is not just an empty void. If you look at the background of the fight space, you can see fragments of architecture that are recognizable as pieces of the Erd tree and of buildings from the lands between. The implication seems to be that the arena exists inside the ring or in a space adjacent to it, and that the ring contains representations of everything it governs. It's not just a law, it's a storage space for the world it rules. If you defeat the Elden Beast and then stand still before interacting with the Elden Ring to trigger one of the endings, and most players don't do this because the temptation to complete the game is overwhelming, you can look around the arena as the fight music fades out. The fragments of architecture in the background begin to shift. They don't move dramatically, just slightly, the way a building settles in the wind. It's a detail with no mechanical significance. It doesn't affect any ending. It's just there for the players who stop for a moment before choosing what to do with a broken world. Malenia's arena is one of the most discussed in the game for obvious reasons. She's famously one of the hardest bosses ever made, but her environment contains details that most players are too busy dying to notice. The room before her fog gate is filled with dead scarlet rot flowers, which sounds like set dressing, but is actually lore. Malenia carries the scarlet rot as a curse and as a kind of power, and the flowers that bloom in her presence are expressions of that curse. Dead flowers mean she's been in that room long enough for them to bloom and die. She's been waiting there for an enormous amount of time. Whatever she was waiting for, you're the closest thing she's encountered to it. The halig tree, where Malenia lives, was grown by her half-brother Miquella, using a technique that isn't fully explained in the game, but that item descriptions suggest involved years of patient, careful magical cultivation. Miquella wanted to grow a tree that could cure the scarlet rot cursing his sister. He poured everything he had into it. He even poured himself into it literally, entering a cocoon within the tree's branches to provide it with his own power as it grew. And then someone stole him, pulled his still sleeping body out of the cocoon and took it away, leaving the halig tree without the power that was sustaining its growth. The tree began to wither, and Malenia stayed to guard what was left. If you look at the halig tree from the outside before entering it, something that requires getting to a specific vantage point in the consecrated snowfield, you can see that the upper sections of the tree are noticeably healthier than the lower sections. The growth that Miquella managed to complete before he was taken is still intact. Only the parts that needed his continued input are failing. It's a tree that stopped in the middle of becoming something, and it's been dying by degrees ever since. Miquella's story is one of the saddest in the game, and one of the most fragmented. He appears directly only as a pale arm extending from a cocoon, and indirectly through the items connected to him and the characters whose lives he touched. He was, by all accounts, loved by nearly everyone who encountered him, a figure of genuine warmth who directed that warmth toward people the Golden Order had rejected. The halig tree was populated by people who had nowhere else to go, individuals with rot, with deformity, with conditions that the official faith had deemed unworthy of its grace. Miquella took them in and tried to build something better. He also made the unalloyed gold needle, an item with specific properties connected to blocking the influence of outer gods. The needle that Millicent carries, the young woman found near Celia, dying of rot, is one of these needles, given to her by Gowry, an old man who serves as the first step in her questline. Gowry is not what he appears to be, and if you complete the questline to its various endpoints, the degree of manipulation involved in Millicent's existence becomes clear in a way that's genuinely uncomfortable. She was created, given a false history, and guided toward a destiny she didn't choose, and yet she faces that destiny with a kind of grace that the game frames as more meaningful because of rather than despite what was done to her. Millicent's questline connects to Malenia's in a specific way that many players understand mechanically. The needle you can give Malenia to suppress her rot, but fewer think about emotionally. Malenia and Millicent are connected by the same curse, the same forced circumstance, the same inability to choose their own nature. Malenia learned to weaponize what she couldn't cure. Millicent learned to endure it. When the two of them are in proximity, even narratively, even through the items that connect them, the game is asking a question about what it means to live with something that will eventually destroy you, and whether the manner of living is what matters most. The mountaintops of the Giants is one of the least visited areas in the game because players often feel burned out by the time they get there, and because the region has a reputation for being bleak, even by Elden Ring standards. But it contains some of the most important lore in the game, and some of the most quietly devastating Easter eggs. The giants themselves, the enormous shaggy creatures with a single eye at the base of their ribcage, are the last of a people who once controlled fire, specifically the flame of ruin that the Erd tree fears above all things. Marika had the giants killed to prevent them from ever using that flame. She had their god killed. She left their homeland frozen and desolate and populated by their uncomprehending descendants. If you listen to the ambient sound in the mountaintops at night, which requires you to just stop moving and wait, there's something in the audio that's not quite wind. It's rhythmic in a way that wind isn't, almost like breathing, almost like a low vocalization from something enormous. Whether that's an intentional sound design choice meant to suggest the giant's collective presence as something almost spiritual, or just a quirk of the audio layering, is not confirmed. But it's consistent across every visit to the region, and it's specifically absent in the daytime audio. Something in that mountain breathes at night. The forge at the top of the giant's homeland is where Marika's servant Melina, if she's still alive at that point in your playthrough, sacrifices herself to light the Erd tree so you can access the capital. Melina's nature is never fully explained in the game. She has a closed eye that, she says, hides something she doesn't want you to see. She has no memories of her own origin. She was found near the Erd tree as an apparently recently born being with no history and no explanation. Various item descriptions and NPC dialogues suggest different origins for her. The most compelling reading involves her relationship to Marika, whose eye was closed in a specific moment of grief that the game depicts symbolically rather than literally. One possible interpretation is that Melina is what Marika lost. Another is that she's what Marika set aside, externalized, separated from herself at a moment when keeping it would have been impossible. The Frenzied Flame questline leads to a completely different area of the game, a cave system beneath the capital that eventually opens into a space called the Frenzied Flame Prescription, a large room with a sealed door and a message warning you not to open it. If you do open it, you receive the Frenzied Flame brand, and you're committed to an ending that involves burning the world, unless you reverse it later through steps that require you to have completed Millicent's and Ranni's questlines. The door itself is interesting. It's not locked in any conventional sense. It's held shut by 3 enormous fingers that press against it from the inside, and to open it, you have to take off all your armor, all your weapons, all your equipment, and approach it completely undefended. The 3 fingers are the counterpart to the 2 fingers of the Golden Order, and they represent a different cosmic will, one that sees wholeness not through structure and order, but through dissolution, through the erasure of all distinction that causes suffering by making things separate from each other. The Frenzied Flame is not presented as straightforwardly evil in the lore. It's presented as a different answer to the same question the game keeps asking about what should happen to a broken world. Whether you accept it as a valid answer or a catastrophically wrong one is left to you. If you've received the Frenzied Flame brand and you speak to characters who have any awareness of the world's deeper currents, their dialogue changes. Hieta, the blind woman you give shabriri grapes to throughout her questline, who turns out to be a prophet guiding you toward the Frenzied Flame, speaks to you differently once you've touched the door. She sounds relieved in a way she didn't before. She sounds like someone who's been working toward a moment for a long time and can finally rest. Whether her relief is touching or terrible depends entirely on what you think of the thing she was working toward. In the mountaintops, There's a small camp of soldiers who are different from every other soldier group in the game. They're not hostile unless you attack them. They're sitting around a fire, not patrolling, not guarding anything obvious, just keeping warm. If you approach slowly and observe them, they don't react to your presence at all. They're not blind. They can clearly see you. They simply don't attack. If you look at the insignia on their armor, it matches a faction that the game establishes as having been completely destroyed in the shattering. These soldiers should not exist. They should have been killed long ago by the chaos of the demigod wars. But they're here by a fire in a region the demigods mostly forgot about, just existing quietly in a world that has no room for them anymore. The dragon communion system in the game, where you can eat the hearts of slain dragons in exchange for dragon-based incantations, contains a hidden layer of lore that most players don't pursue. The dragons in the lands between are not all the same. Some of them are ancient, pre-Erdtree creatures who remember the age of the Crucible. Others are younger, born into the world shaped by the Golden Order. The distinction matters because the incantations you receive from their hearts have different properties depending on which era the dragon belonged to. The older dragon hearts give you incantations that are rougher, more elemental, less precise. The newer ones give you something more structured, more refined, but with a kind of hollowness at the centre. Elder Dragon Grail, the enormous passive dragon in Caelid, who lies there while her children defend her, is one of the oldest living creatures in the lands between. Her item description says she's been asleep for an age and that her roar, which she has not used in that time, is powerful enough to be heard across the entire continent. She doesn't attack you. She doesn't react to you. She lies there while smaller dragons fight on her behalf. And if you kill those smaller dragons one by one, she eventually dies too from accumulated damage. The game allows you to kill her this way. It also allows you to stand next to her without doing anything, which means there are players who have found Grail, understood what she is, and simply walked away. Caelid itself is a devastated region, the result of Malenia's battle with Radahn, in which she unleashed her Scarlet Rot to stop him, destroying both of them and the entire surrounding area in the process. The thing about Caelid that the visual design communicates very effectively is that it used to be beautiful. You can see it in the architecture of the ruined buildings, in the way the land is shaped, in the roads that still run through the rot-covered wasteland, as if the people who built them expected them to be used forever. This was a populated, functional region of the world before a battle between two demigods ended with a bloom of magical plague. The people who lived here didn't choose any of this. They just lived somewhere unfortunate. There's a building in Caelid, the Celia Crystal Tunnel, that predates the rot. The crystals being mined there are ancient, and the techniques being used to extract them are old enough that similar techniques appear in texts from the Siofra civilization underground. The miners who worked there before the rot came were doing something that people have done in the lands between for longer than most recorded history. After the rot, someone kept working there. The miners in the tunnel when you visit are undead, or close to it, still going through the motions of extraction in a poisoned space because they don't know how to stop. It's one of the more quietly devastating images in a game full of them. Radahn himself, the demigod you defeat by participating in a festival in his honour, is a character that most players understand as a villain, or at least an obstacle, before learning more about him. He's a massive, barely human figure, riding a tiny horse through a desert of sand and corpses, and the fight is among the most dramatic in the game. What the lore reveals is that Radahn studied gravity magic specifically so he could keep his beloved horse, Leonard, as a companion, because he grew too large to ride any normal horse and refused to give up the one he loved. He held the stars in place through pure magical will for years because Ranni's plan required the stars to be free, and he opposed that plan. Leonard is not an Easter egg exactly. Everyone knows about the horse. But there's a detail about Leonard that gets less attention. The horse's equipment, the tiny saddle and bridle, on an animal being ridden by a creature 20 times its size, are maintained to a standard far above what Radahn maintains his own equipment to. His armour is rusted, damaged, clearly neglected during his descent into rot-induced madness. Leonard's gear is clean and well cared for. Whatever Radahn forgot about himself during his madness, he never forgot to take care of his horse. After you defeat Radahn, which triggers the starter fall and open access to Nokron, you can return to the arena where the fight took place. The celebration that was happening around the arena, the Radahn Festival, continues in a diminished form. Some of the NPCs who were there remain, but in the arena itself the bodies of soldiers who died during the fight are still there, along with Radahn's own body, or what's left of it. And if you look at the edge of the arena, there's a small grave marker that wasn't there before the fight. It's not marked in any quest or item description. It's just there. Who put it there, and for whom, the game doesn't say. The Mimic Tier boss fight, which takes place in Nokron, is one of the most conceptually interesting in the game. The Mimic Tier is a liquid metal creature that can copy anything it touches, and it copies you at the start of the fight, producing a version of your character with your weapons, your armor, your spells. If you go into the fight without any equipment, without weapons, without spells, without anything, the Mimic Tier copies that too, and you fight an unarmed version of yourself that has no way to hurt you. Most players who do this by accident discover it and feel very clever. But there's another way to interpret it. The Mimic Tier copies your surface. It copies what you present. If you present nothing, it has nothing to become, which suggests that the Mimic Tier's mimicry is not intelligence, it's reflection. The Silver Tiers, the liquid metal enemies scattered throughout Nokron and the adjacent areas, are related to the Mimic Tier, but less developed. Most of them can only form into basic shapes, crude human silhouettes, rolling balls of silver, simple predatory forms. The Mimic Tier is special because it can reach a level of complexity that lets it copy something as complicated as a player character, complete with equipment. Some researchers into the lore have suggested that the Silver Tiers are trying to become something specific, that the liquid metal has an aspirational quality, that each one is attempting to find a form that feels complete. If that's true, then the Mimic Tier is the most successful of them, the one that finally figured out how to do it, which makes it somehow harder to fight. The ancestral followers in Siofra and Nokron worship the giant antlered figures who appear in the background of those regions, enormous creatures who don't interact with you, but whose presence shapes the whole feel of the underground. If you find a high enough vantage point in Siofra, you can see one of these figures clearly, standing in a space too large for most players to reach. It doesn't move. It watches. The ancestral followers perform ceremonies in its honor that involve fire and specific formations, and if you observe one of these ceremonies without interrupting it, you can see that the ceremony has a structure, a beginning and a middle and an end. Something happens at the end of the ceremony that's difficult to describe, a change in the light, a sound that wasn't there before. Whether the ceremony achieves something or just represents the belief that it does is a question the game refuses to answer. The War Counselor E.G., one of the characters connected to Ranni's questline, is a war counselor to her family, and an old man who has clearly been doing a very difficult job for a very long time. His dialogue is among the most carefully written in the game, full of things he's trying to tell you without saying directly. If you complete his questline, or specifically, if you fail it, his fate is connected to the choices you make in ways that aren't telegraphed in advance. And if he dies, there's a gravestone that appears near his post, and the gravestone's inscription matches the inscription on the graves of soldiers who served the Karian family in a much earlier era. He's been there that long. He's been doing this job for longer than most recorded history, and that entire time he's been trying to do it right. The Knight's Sacred Ground in Nokron contains an item called the Finger Slayer Blade, as mentioned earlier, but the room it's in has additional details that most players miss because they're focused on getting the item. The room is set up as a museum, or the equivalent of one. The items displayed in the cases throughout the space, none of which you can interact with, are arranged in an order that tells a story when you trace them from left to right. They begin with astronomical instruments, move through weapons, and end with what appears to be a crown of some kind, displayed on its own, as the conclusion of whatever narrative the display is meant to convey. The civilization of Nokron was documenting its own history in that room, preparing something that was meant to be seen by someone who came later. You are that person. You came later, and the game knows you're not going to read the museum, but it built the museum anyway. The Round Table Hold is the hub area of the game, a space outside of the normal lands between where Tarnished can rest and meet each other. The lore around it establishes that it exists in a kind of pocket dimension, accessible only to those with enough grace to find it. What's less discussed is the architecture of the Hold, which doesn't match any style found elsewhere in the game. The stonework is from a different tradition entirely, cleaner, more deliberately proportioned, built with a kind of structural elegance that suggests it was created by someone with a very specific vision. The Hold was not built for Tarnished, it was built for something else, and then repurposed, which explains why some of the rooms don't quite make sense for the way they're currently used. The library in the Hold, where you find the finger reader Enia, contains books on the shelves that you cannot read. They're props, in the sense that you can't interact with them. But if you look at the spines, which requires you to get close and adjust your camera angle, you can see that some of them have visible text. The text is in a script that appears nowhere else in the game's readable text. It's not just decoration, it's a different language, and no one has successfully decoded what it says, because the resolution of the in-game graphics at that distance makes it impossible to transcribe accurately. It's there, legible to someone with the right tools, and untranslated. The two fingers that Enia serves are withered, pale, enormous versions of the finger motif that appears throughout the game's lore. If you examine them closely during Enia's dialogue scenes, you can see that they're not entirely still. They move slightly, almost imperceptibly, in a rhythm that doesn't match anything happening in the scene. It's a very slow rhythm, much slower than breathing, like a heartbeat that spans minutes rather than seconds. They're alive in a way that the game doesn't draw attention to. They're listening. The Shardbearers, the major demigods who hold pieces of the shattered Elden Ring, each have a specific great rune that reflects what they valued most or what they lost. Godric's great rune fortifies all attributes, reflecting his obsession with absorbing everything he could get his hands on. Renala doesn't have a great rune in the traditional sense, because she's not a Shardbearer by the game's mechanical definition, but there's an item in her arena that functions similarly, connected to the concept of rebirth. Raudan's great rune restores your stats above their maximum when your health drops below a threshold, reflecting a warrior who refused to accept the limits his own body imposed. Morgoth's great rune increases your maximum health, a deeply ironic detail given that Morgoth is an omen, a creature the Golden Order considers inherently cursed. Morgoth is one of the most interesting characters in the game precisely because of that irony. He is the legitimate king of Lendel, the last protector of the Erdtree, a being of genuine conviction who dedicates his existence to defending a faith that considers his very existence an abomination. His boss fight takes place in front of the Erdtree's entrance, and at the end of it, he falls forward toward the tree he spent his life protecting, dying in its shadow. His great rune gives you more life to work with. He gave everything he had to a purpose that would have destroyed him if it had noticed. Morgoth's twin, Moog, went in a completely different direction. Where Morgoth accepted his role and found meaning in service, Moog rejected everything, built his own secret dynasty in the underground, and became the Lord of Blood through devotion to Miquella's blood, which he then used to try to grow Miquella into a god of his own choosing. Mog's great rune involves blood, specifically the transfer of it. The symmetry between the two brothers is one of the most carefully constructed character studies in the game. Two people given the same circumstances, who went to completely opposite extremes and ended up equally consumed by their chosen paths. The deathbird enemies that appear at night in various regions of the lands between are connected to the system of death that was removed from the Elden Ring before the events of the game. They're large, crow-like creatures that drop items associated with death magic when killed. What's notable about them is their behaviour. They don't patrol, they don't search, they appear at specific locations at nightfall, and they wait. If you watch one for long enough without engaging it, it will perform a specific series of movements that look more like ritual than aggression. They're not hunting, they're conducting something. And when dawn comes, they disappear, returning to wherever they came from, having completed or not completed whatever they were there to do. The Tibia Mariner enemies, the skeletal figures who sail through the lands between in ghostly boats and summon skeletons to attack you, are performing a form of funerary rite. In the item descriptions associated with them, and with the death roots they carry, there's a suggestion that they were once responsible for guiding the dead to their proper rest. When death was removed from the Elden Ring, the dead could no longer pass on properly, and the Tibia Mariners kept doing their job in a world that had made their job impossible. They're not hostile in any meaningful sense. They're confused. They're carrying the dead through a world that doesn't have a destination for them anymore. The final area of the game, the fractured Marika statue at the base of the Elden Ring structure, is where every playthrough ends, where you interact with what's left of the shattered ring and choose what to do with it. The statue of Marika is broken, held in place by chains, and the chains are connected to the ring structure in a way that suggests she didn't just observe the ring, but was bound to it. She didn't just keep the ring, she was the ring. Her body and the ring were integrated in a way that the game only reveals through the final visual of the playthrough. There's something in the background of that final space that most players don't see, because the ending trigger is right there, and the temptation to use it is overwhelming. If you look past Marika's statue, past the ring structure, into the void behind it, there are shapes in the darkness that are not random. They're the same shapes that appear in the Elden Beasts arena. They're the same shapes that appear in the frescoes in the deepest parts of Faramazula. They're a visual thread that connects the earliest thing in the world, whatever existed before the Erd Tree and the ring, to the last thing you see before the credits roll. The game begins with the words, "You are tarnished," and a view of a decaying world. It ends with you choosing what that world becomes, or doesn't become, while shapes in the darkness suggest that whatever comes next, something was watching the whole time. Whether that presence is comforting or threatening is a question the game leaves entirely open, the way it leaves most of its best questions. There are Easter eggs in Elden Ring that no one has found yet. There are rooms that have been explored and misunderstood. There are item descriptions that connect to things 3 zones away in ways that no one has drawn the line between yet. The game shipped with more in it than its player base has fully processed, and it will keep giving back to the people who keep looking. There's a detail in the volcano manor that most players process as atmosphere and move on from. The manor is the home of Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, a demigod who chose to be devoured by an ancient serpent god in order to gain its power and, in his words, feast upon the gods themselves. The dining table in the main hall is set, not decoratively set, not abandoned mid-meal, but freshly set, with places laid out as if guests are expected. The food on the table doesn't decay the way food does in other parts of the game. It just sits there, pristine and untouched, waiting for people who are never going to come. Whether this is Tanith's doing, the woman who serves as the manor's host and who maintains her devotion to Rykard long after he has ceased to be recognisably human, is not stated, but someone is setting that table. Someone believes the dinner will eventually happen. Tanith herself is one of the most quietly tragic figures in the game. She runs the assassination questline you undertake, while staying at the manor, sending you to kill shard bearers on behalf of Rykard's ambition. She speaks about Rykard with the specific warmth of someone who loved a person before that person became something else, and who has chosen to love what they became anyway. When you kill Rykard and return to her, she doesn't attack you, not immediately. She just sits with it for a moment, and then she walks to where his body is and she begins to eat it. The game doesn't explain this. It doesn't frame it as horror or as grief or as anything in particular. It just shows you a woman doing the only thing left she could think of to stay close to someone she lost. The Volcano Manor has a lower section that connects to the actual volcanic interior beneath it, and those tunnels contain a population of demi-humans who have been living down there, insulated from the world above, for long enough that they've developed their own material culture. The tools they use are different from the ones found in demi-human camps on the surface. The markings on their walls are more elaborate, more intentional. They've been down here long enough to stop simply surviving and start doing something that looks like living. And then you walk through and kill them, the way you kill everything, because the game requires you to pass through their home to get where you're going. The way the game handles the demi-humans broadly is something worth sitting with. They appear in numerous locations across the lands between, always positioned as enemies, always killable without consequence or comment. But their item drops and the architecture of their settlements suggest a consistent culture with its own internal logic. They use fire, they maintain tools, they bury their dead in specific ways that imply some belief about what happens after death. The game never gives them a quest line, never gives them a named individual who speaks to you as a character rather than as an obstacle. They're just there, everywhere, in camps and caves and tunnels, trying to exist in a world that categorizes them as monsters. The shaded castle in the Altus Plateau is one of those locations that rewards attention in a way the game doesn't advertise. The castle is full of Miranda flowers, the large carnivorous plant enemies that appear in several regions, but in the shaded castle, they've grown through the floors and walls in a way that suggests they've been there for a very long time, long enough for the castle's original inhabitants to have been entirely replaced by them. If you look at the upper rooms, the ones the flowers haven't fully colonized yet, you can see evidence of the people who were there before, ordinary domestic objects, a chair arranged toward a window, clothing that was never picked up again. The flowers grew slowly enough that people had time to leave, but not everyone did. There's an NPC summon sign in the shaded castle that most players walk past without noticing because it's in an unexpected location and because the area's enemies are annoying enough that most people move through quickly. The summon is for a character named Millicent, the same Millicent from the Rot questline, and this is one of the earliest places you can encounter her, as an ally rather than as someone to be helped. If you summon her here and watch her fight, you'll notice something about her technique. She fights like someone who learned to fight alone, without instruction, by working out through trial and error what her body could do. There's no formal style to it. It's improvised and effective and entirely self-taught. She survived long enough to develop that in a world that wasn't interested in helping her do so. The Erd Tree Sanctuary in Lanedale, the grand hall closest to the Erd Tree's actual roots, has a detail in its ceiling that takes several minutes of camera adjustment to fully see. The mosaic up there depicts a scene that the game describes nowhere in text form. It shows figures in postures of supplication arranged around a central form that is neither the Erd Tree nor the Elden Ring as they're depicted elsewhere in the game's imagery. The central form is a gap, a defined, deliberately shaped absence. Whatever was originally at the center of that mosaic was removed, and the surrounding figures were left in place, still bowing toward nothing. Someone took something out of that image and left the worship intact. The Fell Twins boss fight, two omen creatures encountered in the mountaintops, is one of the less celebrated fights in the game because it's relatively straightforward and comes at a point in the playthrough where most players are fatigued. but their presence in that location is strange when you think about it. Omens like Morgoth and Moig are born with horns protruding from their bodies, considered cursed by the Golden Order, typically killed at birth or imprisoned. The Fell Twins are omens of enormous size, more powerful than any typical omen, and they're here in the mountaintops, with no explanation for why they were allowed to live, or how they ended up in this specific desolate location. No item description addresses their origin. No NPC mentions them before or after. They're just here, in the cold, in a region the world mostly abandoned, which is perhaps the only place two cursed creatures of their kind could have survived at all. The consecrated snowfield, the hidden region unlocked by combining two halves of a medallion, is one of the most difficult places in the game to navigate, because it's obscured by an almost complete whiteout of snow and wind. Most players either follow a guide through it or spend a frustrating amount of time discovering its boundaries by walking into invisible walls and cliffs. But if you stop moving and just look during a brief moment when the storm breaks, which happens on a cycle if you wait long enough, the landscape that's briefly visible is genuinely beautiful. The snowfield was not designed only to be difficult, it was designed to be revealed. The game hides its beauty behind patience, the same way it hides most of its other things. There's a tree in the consecrated snowfield, bare and smaller than you'd expect in a landscape of this scale, that has grave offerings arranged around its base. Not treasure, not items with mechanical value. Just the kind of objects people leave at graves. A flower that has no item properties. A broken piece of pottery. A worn-down tool. Someone came to this tree and left these things, and the game modelled them and placed them there for players who would stop and look, knowing that most players wouldn't. The tree has no lore significance that has been documented. It's just a tree where someone grieved. Farum Azula, the crumbling city that floats in a perpetual storm outside of normal time, is where the game goes when it wants to show you something that exists entirely outside its own rules. The architecture is magnificent in a way that the game rarely pauses to celebrate. Enormous structures suspended in mid-collapse, towers that have been falling for so long that their orientation has become the new normal. The creatures that live there are beastmen, and their presence in a place outside of time suggests they have a connection to an era before the current age, a period when the distinction between human and animal was not yet enforced by a faith that preferred its life forms clearly categorized. The Godskin apostles and nobles who appear throughout the game, and who have a significant presence in Farum Azula, wear cloaks made from the skin of gods, or at least from beings that were worshipped as such. The texture of those cloaks is modelled with a specificity that the game's visual design team clearly spent significant time on. If you look at the way the skin moves and the way it catches light, it doesn't behave like fabric. It behaves like something that was once alive and hasn't entirely accepted that it isn't anymore. The Godskin faction operates as an inversion of the Golden Order's structure, organised around the principle that the sacred can be worn, consumed, taken apart, and redistributed. Their theology is uncomfortable because it has an internal logic that holds together. The Blackblade kindred, enormous winged gargoyles who appear guarding certain critical passages in the game, carry black blades that function similarly to the Black Knife assassin's weapons. They deal damage that functions like a tiny death, a piece of your maximum health permanently removed with each hit until the effect wears off. The connection between the kindred and the assassins is something the game establishes through item descriptions but doesn't make explicit in any other way. What that connection means about who was doing what on the night of the Black Knives is left to inference. But the kindred are enormous, ancient, and positioned as guardians, which suggests that whatever they know about that night, they were placed specifically to ensure that certain places remain secure in its aftermath. There is a painting in the Volcano Manor that doesn't match the other paintings in the building. The manor's walls are decorated with work that reflects Rykard's aesthetic, dark, grandiose, figurative in ways that emphasize power and appetite. The painting in the smaller sitting room off the main hall is different. It's a landscape, quiet and domestic, depicting a place that looks like it might be somewhere in the lands between before everything went wrong. Green hills, a small building, an ordinary sky. The style is careful and personal rather than decorative. Someone painted that from memory, or from longing, and then it ended up here, in this house of deliberate transgression, hanging on the wall of a room where someone occasionally sits and doesn't look at anything in particular. The round table hold has a door that you're told explicitly you cannot open. Hugh, the blacksmith, who is bound to the hold and cannot leave it, tells you directly that behind that door is something he can't speak about and that you shouldn't concern yourself with. The game uses Hugh's binding to the hold as a plot point connected to Marika and to his role in crafting a weapon that can kill a god. He's a prisoner who has made peace with his imprisonment because the work gives him a purpose. But the locked door is still there, and he still won't tell you what's behind it. And if you stand near it long enough, you can hear something from the other side that doesn't resolve into anything identifiable. It's not silence. It's the sound of something that has been there for a long time, doing something that is not sleeping. The items dropped by the various bell-bearing hunters, aggressive NPCs, who invade your game at night near sites of grace are called bell-bearings, and when given to a specific merchant at the round table hold, they allow you to buy the dropped inventory of dead merchants. The implication of the system is that the merchants were killed for their bearings, which allowed their goods to be redistributed. The bell-bearing hunters are therefore agents of a system that converts individual merchants into commodity supply chains. They're not random hostile NPCs. They're debt collectors or something adjacent to that, enforcing a mechanism that turns people into catalogues. Given the law around the merchant class and their history of enslavement, the bell-bearing system starts to look like just another iteration of a pattern that the lands between has inflicted on that group consistently throughout its history. The final boss of the Halig tree, Millennia herself, has a second phase that begins when she blooms into a flower form and delivers a devastating attack. The bloom is visually spectacular and the attack is among the most punishing in the game. But if you watch the transformation carefully, rather than panicking and trying to survive it, you can see that the bloom is not aggressive, it's reflexive. She's not attacking, she's flowering, the way the scarlet rot flowers, because that's what this form does. The devastation is incidental to the transformation. She's becoming something, against her will, because the curse inside her reached a threshold. She spent a lifetime containing it, and in the moment of her death, she contains it one final time, pushing through to something on the other side of it. She says, as she dies, that she is the goddess of rot. Not defiantly, not with sorrow, just as a statement of what the process produced. She spent her entire existence refusing that title, and at the end of it, the game gives it to her anyway, as an acknowledgement that what you fight and kill always leaves something behind in you, and the things that nearly kill you give you their names, whether you want them or not. There are more secrets. There will always be more. The Lands Between was built to give back more than it appears to contain, and the people who made it understood that the best thing a world can do is remain worth returning to. Some of those secrets will be found this year. Some of them will wait for a version of the game that runs at a resolution high enough to read the text on those library spines. Some of them are in the sound design, in the music, in the gaps between words, in NPC dialogue, that were written to mean something specific to someone paying a specific kind of attention. The game ends, the world continues, and somewhere in the Lands Between, a scarab is walking its route over an unmarked grave, and it will still be doing that long after everyone who made it has moved on to other things. You said, continue, continue. 1736. Claude responded, The walking mausoleums have a sound they make that most players register as ambient noise and filter out within the first few minutes of hearing it. The walking mausoleums have a sound they make that most players register as ambient noise and filter out within the first few minutes of hearing it. It's a low resonant tolling, like a bell that's too large to ring cleanly, felt as much as heard. If you record that sound and slow it down, which several members of the game's community have done, it resolves into something that has an internal rhythm, a pattern that repeats on a cycle of approximately 4 minutes. Whether that pattern encodes anything, whether it's a musical phrase or a sequence with meaning, has not been conclusively established. But it's too consistent to be random, and the people who made the sound design for this game are not the kind of people who put random things in. The ulcerated tree spirits, the writhing golden enemies that appear in several underground locations and in a handful of surface areas, are one of the more unsettling creature designs in a game full of unsettling creature designs. The lore suggests their failed attempts at growing an Erd tree, or offshoots of the main tree that went wrong somewhere in their development. What makes them disturbing beyond their visual design is their behaviour. They don't patrol. They don't guard anything in a conventional sense. They thrash constantly, without direction, in a way that reads less like aggression and more like pain. Every ulcerated tree spirit in the game is doing the same thing. It's not hunting you. It's just suffering in a space it can't leave, and you walked into that space, and now one of you has to stop. The Oracle envoys, the small creatures that blow bubbles from their horns and appear in the later sections of the game, including Leyndell and Farah Missoula, have an item description that identifies them as messengers of an outer god, beings sent to observe and report. They're not hostile in the aggressive sense. They blow bubbles at you almost apologetically, as if the attack is a formality they're required to perform, while their actual purpose is something else entirely. If you watch a group of them when they're not engaged with you, they orient themselves in specific directions and hold those orientations for extended periods. They're pointing at things. Whether the things they're pointing at have significance that maps onto anything else in the game's geography has not been fully worked out. But they're consistent, and they're deliberate, and they were clearly not designed just to be a mid-game enemy type. The Erd tree itself changes over the course of the game in ways that most players notice but don't fully register because the changes happen gradually and the game doesn't call attention to them. In the early hours, the tree is brilliant gold, dominating the horizon from almost every point in the lands between, a constant visual anchor. As you progress and the events of the main quest accumulate, the tree's light begins to shift. By the time you reach Leyndell, it's already different, and by the time the ash falls, it's something else entirely, something that looks less like a beacon and more like a wound. The tree's visual evolution is tracking something about the state of the world's governing principle, and if you pay attention to it, across the whole playthrough, it reads as a slow health bar for a system that was already failing when you arrived. There are roots beneath Leyndell that have broken through the foundations of the city and grown up through the floors of certain buildings, and the buildings around those roots have been partially demolished and rebuilt to accommodate them, which means the city's inhabitants accepted the tree's intrusion into their architecture and rerouted their lives around it, rather than cutting the roots back. This tells you something about the relationship between the Golden Order and the Erd tree that the lore only implies. The tree is not just worshipped, it's deferred to in the most physical, literal sense. When it grows into your house, you rebuild your house around it. The faith is not metaphorical. It rearranges the material world. The remembrances you collect from major bosses, which can be traded for unique weapons or spells, or consumed for runes, have item descriptions that are among the most carefully written text in the game. Each one is short, dense, and contains at least one detail that expands what you understand about the boss you just killed. Radahn's remembrance mentions the stars he held in place, and the weight of that holding in terms that make it clear it was not an effortless act. It cost him something continuous to do it, every moment, for years. He held the sky in place through sustained effort, while simultaneously losing himself to rot, which means the last coherent thing he used his power for was an act of preservation. Not conquest, not worship. Just holding something still because he'd decided it should stay. Renala's remembrance, or the item equivalent connected to her story, refers to her as the Queen of the Full Moon and mentions the amber egg she cradles in her second phase. The egg contains Renala's most precious rebirth, the item description says, and players have speculated for years about what that means specifically. The leading reading is that the egg contains the potential of a child that was never born, a rebirth Renala has been holding in reserve, for reasons the game doesn't make entirely explicit. She lost her children to the shattering. She lost her husband to another woman. She retreated into the library and into memory. And she held on to one last possibility, one last thing that hadn't happened yet, cradling it through years of grief, the way someone might keep a door unlocked for a person who stopped coming home. The Great Jar, a large ceramic pot NPC in Kylid, who challenges you to defeat 3 warrior jar summons before he'll give you his talisman, is played almost entirely as a joke. He's a giant pot. He nods. He communicates via nod. He makes you prove yourself in a trial by combat before he rewards you. It's one of the lighter moments in a game that doesn't often do light moments. But the talisman he gives you, the Great Jar's arsenal, has an item description that mentions the Great Jar in terms that don't quite fit the comedic register of the encounter. It refers to him with a gravity that implies he has a history, that the trial he administers is not whimsy but tradition, and that whoever he was before he became a very large pot sitting in a crater in Kylid, he retained something essential enough to be worth seeking out. The Jar people in general, Alexander and his kin, exist in the lore as warriors who stuff themselves with the remains of fallen fighters to absorb their strength. Alexander talks about this openly and with enthusiasm, as if the consumption of the dead is the most natural and admirable thing in the world. And within the Jar people's framework, it is. They've built a complete philosophy around it, one that treats death as a resource and grief as something that can be processed by incorporation. By the end of Alexander's questline, which ends as most questlines in this game end, in loss, what he's accumulated inside himself over the course of his journey is significant enough that the item you get from him is among the most powerful of its type. He became what he consumed. He always said he would. The Dung Eater, one of the most deliberately repellent characters in the game, sits in the round table hold, covered in blood that isn't his, and tells you calmly about his purpose, which is to curse every living thing with the omen mark, so that nothing can ever pass on cleanly to whatever comes after death. He's positioned as straightforwardly evil, and the game doesn't complicate that framing much. But the omen curse he wants to spread is the same curse that produced Morgoth, who became the last defender of the Erd Tree, and Moog, who tried to build an alternative dynasty out of love for his brother. The curse marks people as unclean. The people it marked built the most complicated and human stories in the game. Whether that's a coincidence or an argument, the game leaves for you to decide. The puppet merchants, the seated figures in various locations throughout the lands between who sell goods in exchange for runes, are never explained. They don't speak. They don't react to you beyond the transaction. They hold out their goods with a gesture that has been practiced enough to become mechanical. Early in the game, you accept them as a feature of the world without questioning them, because they're useful, and the game has a lot of unfamiliar things to absorb. Later, if you've read enough item descriptions and followed enough questlines, you start to understand the merchant class's history well enough to look at these seated figures and feel the specific discomfort of understanding what you're looking at. They're not automata, they were people, and the system they're embedded in extracted everything from them except the function. The shard-bearer Godwyn, the Golden, is unique among the major figures in the game's history, because he doesn't appear as a boss. He's dead before the game begins, his soul killed on the night of the Black Knives, his body left alive and growing in the roots beneath the lands between, in a form of existence that has no precedent and no name. The thing that Godwyn became is called the Prince of Death by the game's descriptions, and his body, vastly expanded into something that has colonized the underground, appears in a late-game area in a form that is recognizable as having once been human only if you already know what you're looking for. The tragedy of Godwyn is the purest form of the game's recurring theme about what happens when the natural order of things is disrupted. Death was removed from the Elden Ring. Godwyn was the first to experience the consequences of that removal in the most literal possible way. He couldn't die. His soul was gone, and his body kept growing, kept becoming, without direction or limit or the mercy of an ending. The face that appears in the roots, enormous and serene and utterly absent, is the face of someone who had all the kindness taken out of their story and left with only the continuation. He was beloved. The game tells you this repeatedly, through the grief of the characters who knew him. And then it shows you what beloved looks like after enough time without an ending. There are birds in Elden Ring. Not enemy birds, not the giant worm-faced creatures or the death birds or the oracle envoys, but small ordinary birds that perch on ruins and take off when you approach. They have no lore significance. They drop nothing. They're not connected to any questline or mechanic. They exist in the world because someone on the development team put them there, and then put them somewhere else, and somewhere else after that, scattering small living things through a landscape of ruin and grief and enormous consequence. They take off when you get close. They land somewhere nearby. They do this all day, in a world that is ending or has ended or is trying to end, and they do it without reference to any of that. The person who put those birds in understood something important about what it means to build a world that people will spend hundreds of hours inside. Not everything can carry meaning. Not everything should. Some things are just alive, just present, just doing what they do in the space between the things that matter. The birds are there so that the lands between feels inhabited rather than constructed. They're there so that in the middle of reading the tragedy of Godwyn or the grief of Renala or the long patience of Iji, you can look up and see a bird land on a broken wall and sit there for a moment before flying away. They're there because the people who made this game loved it. Not efficiently, not strategically, but in the way you love something you've put more of yourself into than you planned to, more than could ever be recovered or accounted for. They built a world with birds in it because a world without birds would have been slightly less true, and they cared enough about the truth of it to add the birds. That's the final secret, in a way. Not a hidden room or a mistranslated item description or a pattern in the sound design. Just the accumulated evidence, in 1,000 small decisions across an enormous game, that the people who made it were paying attention. That they thought about what it would feel like to stand in a specific spot at a specific time of day and look at a specific piece of architecture. That they put something there for that moment, for the player who would stand there, even knowing that most players wouldn't. You can't find all the secrets in Elden Ring. The game is too large and too carefully made and too patient, but you can find the feeling underneath them, which is the feeling of being in a place that was built with genuine care by people who believed it was worth caring about. That's worth more than any item drop. You said, continue, 1739. Claude responded, there is a chair in the artist shack in Limgrave that faces a canvas. There is a chair in the artist's shack in Limgrave that faces a canvas. The canvas has a painting on it, partially finished, depicting a landscape that doesn't match the area immediately surrounding the shack. This is the beginning of the Painter questline, a series of locations you visit by finding paintings and then locating the real-world spots they depict. The mechanic is elegant and quiet, asking you to read a painting carefully enough to identify where the artist was standing when they imagined it, and then go stand there yourself. It's one of the few quest lines in the game that asks you to practice a specific kind of looking, the kind where you're not searching for danger or resources, but just trying to understand what someone else saw. The painter herself is never present at the shack when you arrive. She's always already moved on to the next place, the next view, the next thing she needed to see. You follow her path without ever catching her, arriving at her vantage points after she's left them, finding only the evidence of her attention. At the end of the quest line, you find her gift, left for you at the final location, an item that carries her perspective without carrying her. She was here. She looked at this. She wanted you to find it. That's the whole quest line. Someone moving through the world with purpose and leaving traces for whoever came after, which is also, at a sufficient level of abstraction, what From Software did with the entire game. The way paintings function in the lands between more broadly is worth thinking about. They appear throughout the game as environmental decoration, in manor houses and castle halls and academic institutions, and most players don't examine them closely because there's usually something trying to kill you nearby. But the paintings that appear as set dressing are not generic fantasy art. They depict specific places that exist in the game world, specific moments of light on specific landscapes, painted with a level of specificity that implies someone in the fiction of the lands between stood in those places and chose to record them. There were artists here. There were people who looked at this broken world and thought it was worth painting. That act of looking and recording and preserving is happening in the background of a game about war and succession and cosmic horror, and the game never draws attention to it. It just makes sure the paintings are there for the people who look at walls. The stone-sword keys, consumable items you use to break imp seals on fog walls blocking optional areas, have an item description that identifies them as keys carved by artisans for the purpose of granting access to sealed spaces. The implication is that the seals themselves were a system, that there was a logic to what got sealed and what didn't, and that the keys were distributed deliberately to people who were supposed to have access. The system has clearly broken down by the time you arrive, since the keys are scattered everywhere, and the imp statues that enforce the seals have been sitting in place for what appears to be an enormous amount of time. But the system existed. Someone decided what was worth sealing. Someone decided who should be able to enter. And somewhere in that original decision is a set of priorities and values that the current state of the lands between has completely overwritten. What's behind the imp seals is almost always interesting, almost always slightly different in character from the areas surrounding them, as if the sealing preserved something of the original context. The sealed areas tend to be older or stranger, or to contain things that don't quite fit the current era. The seals kept them from being absorbed into the present, and the keys let you step briefly outside of what the lands between currently is and into what it was or what it was trying to become before things went the way they went. Ania, the finger reader at the round table hold, translates the will of the two fingers for the player and provides the mechanical function of exchanging remembrances for unique items. She's presented as ancient and devoted, and her dialogue is warm in the specific way of someone who's been doing a sacred task for so long that the sacred and the routine have become indistinguishable. But there's something in the timing of her responses that players who've spent significant time in her dialogue have noted. She occasionally pauses before speaking, not in a way that reads as processing time, but in a way that reads as listening. She tilts her head slightly during these pauses. She's checking something before she answers. She hears things you don't, or she receives information through channels the game models, but doesn't explain. And then she tells you what she's been authorized to tell you, which may not be all of what she knows. The two fingers she serves communicate in a way that bypasses language, which is why a finger reader is necessary in the first place. The translation process is not mechanical. It requires Enia's interpretation, her judgment, her sense of what the communication means in terms a Tarnished can act on, which means that everything the two fingers have ever told anyone who came through the round table hold passed through Enia's understanding first. She's not a transparent channel, she's an interpreter, with all the agency and all the responsibility that implies. What she chose to emphasize, what she chose to soften, what she understood one way when it might have been meant another, has shaped the course of Tarnished action in the lands between, for as long as she's been sitting in that library, listening to something only she can hear. The Tarnished furled finger, the item you use to leave cooperative summon signs for other players, has a description that places it in the lore in a specific way. The furled fingers of Tarnished are connected to the guidance of grace, to the system by which the outer force that calls Tarnished back to the lands between communicates with them. Leaving a summon sign is therefore not just a mechanical cooperative feature. Within the fiction, it's an act of making yourself available through the same system that's been guiding you, offering your presence to someone else's struggle the way grace offered itself to yours. The multiplayer system and the lore are the same system, which is either a piece of clever design thinking or an indication of how thoroughly From Software integrated every element of the game's construction into a single coherent vision. The messages players leave for each other operate similarly. The lore of the lands. Between includes the idea of guidance left by those who came before, traces of attention and experience that persist after the person who left them has moved on. The message system literalizes this as a multiplayer feature and then embeds it in the fiction so completely that you can't fully separate the two. When you read a message left by another player and it helps you, the gratitude you send back has a mechanical effect, restoring their health in their own game. Care for each other's traces has a real consequence. The fiction and the function are making the same argument. The grafted scion, the optional boss in the tutorial cave that kills most players the first time they encounter it, is not supposed to be fought at that point. The game makes this clear through the framing of the encounter and the placement of an exit route that bypasses the fight entirely. It's an early statement about the game's design philosophy, the presence of an obstacle that you're not required to overcome, that tests whether you understand the difference between what the game asks of you and what the game contains. Most players die to it anyway. Some players kill it on their first encounter through sheer stubbornness, and the game rewards this with a good item drop, which is a separate statement about what stubbornness sometimes produces. What the grafted scion is, lore-wise, is a creature made from many bodies grafted together, a small version of the principle that Godric would later adopt at scale. It's sitting in the tutorial cave. It was there when the cave was otherwise empty of significant threats, which raises the question of how it got there, and whether its presence is connected to the cave's earlier history as a burial space. A creature made from many bodies in a place that was once full of bodies. Whether it grew there from what was available, or whether it was placed there by something that understood what it was making, is a question the game raises by juxtaposition and then declines to answer. The scion also drops an item that most players don't see on their first playthrough because they're either dead or fleeing. The ornamental straight sword and golden beast crest shield that it carries are items with descriptions that connect to the early history of Leyndell, to a period of ceremony and display that predates the grimness of the current era. These are dress weapons, made for occasions rather than for combat, and the grafted scion is carrying them, which either means it was grafted together from people who were dressed for a ceremony, or that someone equipped it with items that meant something to them before they became part of it. The way the game uses silence is something that only becomes fully apparent after many hours, when you've calibrated to its rhythms enough to notice when something is missing. There are spaces in the lands between where the ambient sound drops out almost entirely, not to a background hum, but to something close to actual quiet. These spaces are not consistently marked by anything visual. They're not all underground or all ruins or all associated with a specific lore element. They seem to appear in places where something significant happened and then stopped, where an event concluded and the space is still settling into what comes after. The silence is the sound of aftermath. The game modelled aftermath as an audio condition and placed it in specific locations so that players with headphones on, in a quiet room, would walk into those spaces and feel, before they could articulate why, that something had happened here. There is a small cluster of graves in the Weeping Peninsula, in an area that has no nearby dungeon entrance, and no significant enemy presence, that is arranged in a pattern you don't see at any other gravesite in the game. The graves face each other, rather than facing outward, in a rough circle, like people who wanted to keep talking after they were done. There are 7 of them. The number isn't explained. The arrangement isn't explained. They're just there, in the green hills of the Weeping Peninsula, in a spot where the game is otherwise quiet and unremarkable. 7 graves facing each other in a circle. And if you stand in the centre of the circle, the camera angle means you're surrounded by them, briefly held inside the arrangement, inside whatever logic placed them that way. The Weeping Peninsula gets its name from something the game gestures at, rather than states directly. The rain there is consistent in a way the rain elsewhere in the lands between is not. It rains in other regions during the day-night cycle, intermittently, as weather. In the Weeping Peninsula, it rains the way grief works, as a condition rather than an event, present when you're there and presumably still present after you leave. The people who named the region were making a statement about its character, and the character they were describing is not the character of a place where bad things happen. It's the character of a place where something was lost, specifically and irretrievably, and the landscape registered the loss. Commander O'Neill, the field commander in the middle of the Aeonian swamp in Caelid, is one of the stranger boss encounters in the game. He's surrounded by soldiers who function as summons he calls during the fight, and he's standing in the middle of the rot as if he's been there for a long time. His armour is partially corroded, his equipment shows the specific damage of long exposure to the scarlet rot environment. He didn't arrive recently. He's been in this swamp since the battle that created it, or shortly after, commanding troops who are also mostly rotted in ways that suggest extended exposure. He's still fighting a battle that ended, holding a position that no longer means anything, with soldiers who are degrading around him because the orders haven't been rescinded, and he's the kind of person who doesn't stop until the orders change. The item you can get from his questline connection, the unalloyed gold needle that eventually reaches Millicent, passes through O'Neill's fight in a way that connects a military figure to a medical one, a commander's battlefield to a young woman dying in a village. The needle was in the swamp. It was in the middle of a battle that should have destroyed everything near it. The fact that it survived and found its way to someone who needed it is either a coincidence the game uses for plot convenience, or a statement about the persistence of things made with genuine care and specific purpose. Michaela made the needle to help people. The needle went through a catastrophe and kept being what it was made to be. Gowry's shack, the small structure near Celia, where you first receive the needle from the old man who sends you to Millicent, has a detail that most players who complete his questline eventually notice and then wish they hadn't. The shack is in the same visual style as other structures associated with a specific lore element that reveals itself late in Millicent's story. The connection between Gowry's apparent role as a helpful hermit and his actual nature is not hidden in any dramatic way. It's in the architecture, it's in the placement, it's in the way certain items are arranged inside the shack in an order that makes a different kind of sense once you know what you're looking at. The game told you what Gowry was before you had the context to understand it, in the way it often tells you things before you have the context to understand them, trusting that the second understanding will be more meaningful for having been preceded by the first. The Amber Starlight item, used in one step of Millicent's questline, has a description that connects it to the outer god that Malenia is a vessel of. the same rot god whose influence created the swamp and the flowers and the bloom. The description is brief and uses language that implies the starlight predates the rot, that it's something the rot moves toward or responds to, rather than something it produces, which raises the question of what the rot is oriented around, what it's moving toward when it spreads, whether its devastation is incidental to a purpose, or whether the purpose is the devastation. The game doesn't resolve this. It gives you enough to ask the question clearly, and then leaves you to sit with it. The star scourge Radan, before his battle with Melania, before his rot, before his reduction to the feral thing you fight at the festival, was a scholar. The game mentions this, and most players register it as background detail, an ironic contrast between what he was and what he became. But the scholarship is specific. He studied at Raya Lucaria under Lusat and Azur, the two sorcerers who pushed past the Academy's acceptable boundaries to receive the full magic of the stars directly. Radan took what he learned from them and applied it to gravity, to the fundamental force rather than to the light and distance that sorcery more conventionally engages with. He became the strongest demigod in the lands between through an education, through reading and study and finding teachers who understood more than convention allowed and learning from them everything they could give. The gravity that Radan mastered is also the force he used to hold the stars in place, which means his greatest act of power and his greatest act of care were the same act, performed with the same understanding. He held the stars still because Rani's plan required them to move, and he opposed that plan, but also because he understood stars, because he had studied them and learned them, and they were not abstract to him. He kept them in place the way you keep something in place, when you know what it is and what it would mean to lose it. After Radan is defeated and the stars fall and the crater opens in Limgrave, there is a period in the game where you can visit the site of the Radan Festival arena and find it changed. The winds that were associated with Radan's gravity magic have stilled. The sand that was constantly in motion during the fight lies flat. The arena is quieter than it was, in the specific way of a place where a sustained effort has ended. The effort is over. The stars moved. Whatever Radan was holding against is done being held against. The stillness of that arena after the fight is the stillness of a force that spent everything it had and is now simply absent. And if you stand in it long enough without doing anything, the game lets you feel the weight of that absence as a physical quality of the space. There are details in this game that no one has found. There are connections between item descriptions that haven't been drawn. There are sounds in the audio that haven't been slowed down or isolated or run through the kind of analysis that would reveal whether they contain information. There are textures on surfaces that haven't been examined at the resolution required to see what's on them. There are behaviours in enemies that occur rarely enough that no one has been in the right place at the right time to record them. There are things in this game that exist entirely unseen, that have existed unseen since the game launched, that may continue to exist unseen for years. This is not a failure of the player base. The game is simply larger than the attention that has been brought to it, which is itself a kind of statement about what From Software built and why. They built a world that exceeds examination. They built something that rewards attention without requiring it, that holds secrets without demanding they be found, that persists in its fullness whether or not anyone is looking. The Lands Between was made to be more than anyone could know. That's the design philosophy underneath all the other design philosophies, the one that explains why the birds are there and why the graves face each other in circles and why the mausoleum ceiling matches the Erd tree roots, and why there is text in a library that no one can read. They made a world that could not be exhausted. They made something that would still be giving back to the people who looked at it long after everyone who made it had moved on. There's a word for that, several words in several traditions, for the quality of a made thing that exceeds its maker's ability to account for it, that takes on a life independent of its origins, that becomes real in the way that only the most carefully loved things become real. The lands between is that kind of place. It has that quality, and the proof is that you're still here, still reading about it, still wanting to know what else is there, still willing to go back and look again. That's what it means to build something true. It means building something people can't finish with. There is a moment in Ranni's questline after you've given her the Finger Slayer blade and she's rewarded you with her amber medallion and dismissed you, where she says she will be waiting in the Sea of Stars. Most players register this as poetic language, the kind of ethereal phrasing the game uses when it wants to signal significance without being explicit. But the Sea of Stars is a specific place in the game's cosmology, not a metaphor. The stars that Radan was holding in place, the stars that Ranni's plan required to move, are connected to a system of cosmic navigation that the underground civilizations were mapping and that the Academy was studying, and that Ranni herself understands, in a way no other character in the game approaches. When she says she'll be waiting in the Sea of Stars, she is describing a destination. She has somewhere to go. She has had somewhere to go for a very long time, and everything that happened in the lands between, the night of the Black Knives, the shattering, your entire journey was the process of her getting there. The ending you receive for completing Ranni's questline is the only ending in the game that sends the world somewhere. Every other ending is a restoration or a transformation or a destruction of what already exists. Ranni's ending sends everything into the unknown, into a dark moon over a dark sea, into a future that is genuinely open in a way the other futures are not. The Age of Stars she promises is not described in terms of what it will contain. It's described only in terms of its distance from what came before. She's not offering a better version of the lands between. She's offering somewhere else entirely. Whether that's hope or terror depends entirely on how you feel about the world you just spent 100 hours in, and whether you think it's worth saving or worth leaving behind. The Snow Witch set, the armour associated with Ranni that you can find in Ranni's Rise, has a description that connects it to a tradition of magic older than the Academy sorcery and different in character from the Carian royal magic that Ranni's family practiced. Snow Witch magic is described as a magic of cold and distance, of preservation through separation, of keeping things apart so they remain what they are rather than becoming something else through contact. This is also a description of Ranni's psychology. She spent the entirety of the game's events separated from everyone, operating through intermediaries, keeping herself at a distance from the consequences of her own plan, so that she could remain the person the plan required her to be. The magic she's associated with and the way she moves through the world are the same principle, expressed in different registers. The doll she inhabits enforces this separation literally. She cannot be touched in the conventional sense. She cannot be affected by the physical world in the way a body can be affected. She chose a form that keeps everything at a slight remove, and she chose it deliberately as preparation, which means she understood that the plan she was putting into motion would require her to be unreachable for its duration. She made herself into something that could not be held because she knew that what she was doing would make people want to hold on to her, and she couldn't afford to be held. There is a gesture in the game called the Ranni gesture, obtained during her questline, in which your character mimics Ranni's characteristic pose, one hand raised, chin slightly lifted, an attitude of cool authority combined with something that in a different context might read as wistfulness. Players use this gesture in multiplayer interactions, near Ranni's locations, in photographs of the game shared online. It has become one of the most recognizable poses in the game's community. What most people don't think about when they perform it is that it's a grief pose. The authority in it is real, but the thing underneath the authority, the thing the slight angle of the head is protecting, is something much more exposed. Ranni lost her body. She lost the life she would have had. She lost everyone she was supposed to be connected to through the systems the Two Fingers manage. She did all of this on purpose, with intention, and then she stood like this while she waited for the rest of the plan to resolve, holding herself in an attitude that communicated completion while something underneath it was anything but. Blade, the half-wolf warrior who serves Ranni, and who you encounter in several stages of her questline, is one of the characters the game's community has responded to most strongly, with an attachment that the game earns through the specificity of his writing and his presence. He's enormous, wolf-headed, speaks with a directness that reads as loyalty rather than simplicity, and he clearly loves Ranni in a way that the game declines to categorize or explain, that exists somewhere in the space between devotion and grief, and the particular tenderness of someone who has spent years watching over a person who doesn't need watching over, but who he watches over anyway. His fate is one of the most painful in the game, which is an extremely competitive category. He was created by the Two Fingers to serve Ranni, to be her shadow, and embedded in his creation was a fail-safe, a mechanism that would turn him against her if her plan succeeded, if she moved far enough outside the system that the Two Fingers could no longer tolerate her. He doesn't know this. He serves her completely, with everything he has, without reservation, because that's what he is. And then the plan succeeds, and the mechanism activates, and you find him at Ranni's rise, after completing the questline. No longer himself, the loyalty that defined him turned into its own opposite, requiring you to kill the person who was, by any reasonable measure, the best character in the game. The item you get from Blade is his armor set, and his weapon, the Royal Great Sword, which has an item description that refers to the friendship between Blade and Ranni in terms that are careful and plain and exactly as devastating as plainness can be. It says they were as close as could be. It doesn't reach for the grand language the game usually uses for significant relationships. It just says they were as close as could be, and that's the sentence you read while holding the item dropped by someone you just had to kill, and the plainness of it is worse than any elaborate tragedy would have been. Ranni never addresses Blade's fate directly in her dialogue. She doesn't acknowledge it in your final encounter with her at the ending. She is gone, beyond, into the sea of stars, and whatever she feels about what the plan required is something she's taken with her into a distance that you cannot follow. Whether that's a flaw in her or a mercy or simply the cost of being the person who could do what needed to be done is a question the game leaves in the specific way it leaves its best questions, without a frame around it, just sitting there in the open. Fia, the deathbed companion who offers you an embrace in the round table hold that slightly reduces your maximum health, is one of the most visually unusual characters in the game in terms of how she's positioned in her space. She sits on the bed in her room in a posture that reads as invitation and also as exhaustion, as someone who has been doing something for a very long time and whose warmth has become indistinguishable from the duty that produces it. She holds tarnished because their accumulated deaths give her something she needs, some essence of mortality that she's collecting for a purpose she reveals slowly over the course of her questline. The questline leads underground to a version of the deep-root depths where Fia has gone to hold the body of Godwyn and try to give him something the game calls a proper death, a real ending to replace the endless non-death he's been experiencing since the Night of the Black Knives. What she wants to do is technically a desecration according to the Golden Order. What she wants to do is an act of profound compassion by any other measure, an attempt to give rest to someone who has been denied it. The two things are both true simultaneously, which is where most of the interesting ethical questions in this game live, in the space where the official designation and the human reality point in completely different directions. Her embrace costs you maximum health. This is the mechanical fact most players remember first about Fia, but the description of what the embrace is in lore terms is that she's sharing in your deaths, taking something of the mortality you carry with you. She's not taking health from you exactly. She's taking death, which is different. She's holding some of what you've accumulated through dying over and over in the lands between. and she's holding it with the same warmth she holds everything, because that's the only way she knows how to hold things. There is a room in the deep-root depths that predates Fia's presence there, a space that was clearly significant to the underground civilization before it became connected to her questline. The room has the same astronomical orientation as the structures in Siofra, the same attention to the relationship between what's above and what's below, but the item placed in the centre of the room, around which Fia's questline culminates, is connected to Godwyn, to the Golden Order, to the surface world. Two things that were completely separate have converged in this room: the ancient underground civilization's sense of the sacred and the surface world's most devastating tragedy, and the convergence was not planned by either. It happened because the shape of the world made it inevitable. Prince of Death's pustule, one of the items found in the areas connected to Godwyn's spread through the underground, has a description that does more lore work in fewer words than almost any other item in the game. It tells you that Godwyn's spread is not purposeless, that the growth his body is doing underground follows a logic, that he is becoming something, not in the way that living things become things, but in the way that very slow processes become things, over geological time, without intent or awareness. He's not growing toward anything, he's just growing, the way water finds the lowest point, the way roots find water, through pure tendency rather than decision. The question that description raises, and that the game doesn't answer, is what Godwyn will eventually become if nothing interrupts the process. The underground is vast. His spread, as depicted in the late areas of the game, is already enormous. If it continues for as long as the lands between continues to exist, what does the end point look like? The game gives you no framework for answering this because there is no framework. It's a new thing happening in the world for the first time. Nobody knows what it becomes. Nobody who made the world knew either, because it wasn't supposed to be possible. And the things that weren't supposed to be possible are the things the game is most interested in. The crucible of life that appears in the game's lore as a concept, distinct from the crucible knights who are its remnants, was the state of the world before the Erd Tree's ordering principle imposed fixed categories on living things. In the crucible, everything was continuous with everything else. Life shaded into life without clear boundaries. Forms were temporary expressions of a common substance rather than permanent essences. The Erd Tree ended this not violently, but by establishing an alternative so compelling and so total that the older way simply receded. Fixed forms were better for the Golden Order's purposes. Categorization was better for governance. The fluidity of the crucible was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they're true, and it was replaced with something more useful. The Erd Tree's roots connect everything underground, and the items found in those root-filled spaces suggest that the roots are not just structural, not just the physical anchor of the tree, but something more like a nervous system, a way of distributing the tree's presence throughout the ground beneath the lands between. Everything that grows in the lands between grows in relation to those roots, whether it knows it or not. The ancient civilizations underground built their cities in the spaces between the roots, oriented themselves around the root network without necessarily understanding what it was. They thought they were mapping stars. They were also mapping the underside of the Erd Tree's influence, the part of the order that works below the surface of awareness. The way grace appears in the game, the golden wisps that float through the air and orient you towards sights of grace and toward the path forward, is described in lore terms as the guidance of a higher power, a signal from outside the lands between directed at Tarnished specifically. What the game doesn't dwell on is the question of why that guidance takes the form it takes, why an outer cosmic entity would communicate through floating golden particles rather than through direct instruction or compulsion. The grace leads rather than commands. It suggests rather than demands. It can be ignored, wandered away from, returned to after long absence. It's designed for beings who need to find their own way, but might benefit from orientation. Whoever designed it understood something about how tarnished work, what they respond to, what they need. The grace is calibrated for its recipients, which implies the recipients were anticipated, their nature understood, their particular mixture of stubbornness and responsiveness accounted for in the design. You were expected. Not you specifically, but the kind of being you are, the tarnished who would wash up on the shore and follow the light not because they had to, but because they chose to. The whole structure was built for someone with your particular quality of attention, and then it waited for as long as it needed to until you arrived. There's something in that which most players never stop to consider, because the game is always moving forward, and there's always something ahead demanding your attention. But in the quiet moments, in the spaces where the ambient sound drops out and the grace floats past and you're standing in the ruins of something enormous and old, it's possible to feel it. The sense that the world was built to be found by someone like you, that the secrets are there because you were always going to look for them, that the whole extraordinary construction of the lands between, its tragedies and its mysteries, and its birds and its painted landscapes, and its circles of graves, was assembled with a specific reader in mind. You are that reader. You always were. And the game has known it since the moment you washed up on that shore and started moving toward the light. There is a detail about the sight of grace resting animation that most players see thousands of times without fully seeing. When your character sits at a sight of grace, they don't sit the way a person sits when they're tired. They sit the way a person sits when they're listening. The posture is attentive rather than restful, spine upright, head slightly lowered, hands open. It's a posture of reception. You're not recovering at a sight of grace in the way that sleep recovers you. You're being refilled by something, and the sitting is the position your body takes when it's receiving something from outside itself. The golden light that pools around the grace doesn't emanate outward. It flows inward, toward the sitting figure, toward you. Most light sources in the lands between push light away from themselves. Grace pulls it in. This is a small distinction that the rendering team clearly made deliberately, and it changes what the sights of grace are in a way that the lore only partially articulates. They're not campfires. They're not save points in the conventional sense. They're mouths. They're places where the guidance that suffuses the lands between is closest to the surface, where the thing that called you back is most present. And when you sit in one, you are briefly in direct contact with whatever that thing is. Whether that contact is comforting is a question the game declines to answer on your behalf. The walking animation of the player character is different in different regions of the game, a detail so subtle that most players would deny it if you told them. In Limgrave and the early areas, the movement has a quality of openness, a slight forward lean that reads as curiosity or momentum. In Caelid, in the ash-covered streets of Leindel, in the deep underground areas, that lean is gone. The character moves more carefully, more weighted, as if the ground itself is less trustworthy. Whether this is an intentional animation adjustment, responding to the terrain's visual character, or simply the result of different surface physics, producing different movement qualities, is not something that has been confirmed. But players who have spent enough time in both regions and then gone back and forth report feeling the difference before they can name it. The body knows the lands between region by region. It moves differently in places where bad things happened. The Erdtree avatar enemies, the enormous golden figures that guard Erdtree minor branches throughout the lands between, carry a staff that blooms with golden light when they attack. The blooming is not instant. If you watch the animation carefully rather than dodging, which requires a specific kind of trust in your own timing, you can see that the bloom starts from the center of the staff and moves outward. The way a real flower opens, from inside to outside, from the protected core to the exposed surface. It takes about 2 seconds. In a boss fight, 2 seconds is an enormous amount of time, long enough to read the motion and respond. The game is giving you time to watch it, if you're willing to risk standing still long enough to look. The avatars themselves are described in item drops as caretakers, beings whose purpose is the tending and protection of the Erd tree's lesser expressions in the world. They are gardeners, essentially, of enormous size and lethal capability, doing a job that was necessary and good before the world's condition made it something that had to be done with violence. The hostility isn't a corruption of their purpose. It's the purpose adapting to circumstances. A garden that everything is trying to destroy has to be defended differently than a garden that everything is trying to tend. There is a type of flower in the lands between called the Triner's lily, associated with Saint Trina, a figure of ambiguous gender and enormous lore significance, who is connected to sleep, to the mercy of unconsciousness, to the idea that not knowing can be a gift rather than a deprivation. Saint Trina appears nowhere in the game as a character you can speak to or a boss you can fight. She exists entirely through the flowers that grow where she walked, and the items and spells that carry her name, and the fragments of description that accumulate around her, like sediment. She is a presence made entirely of evidence and absence, which is not unusual in this game, but is taken further with Trina than with almost anyone else. The sleep she embodies is not passive in the way that sleep usually reads in the context of a game about combat. It's protective. The item descriptions suggest that Trina's sleep is something she offers rather than something she inflicts, a kind of mercy extended to those who are suffering, a temporary removal from a situation that the sufferer is not equipped to endure. She puts things to sleep so they don't have to feel what's happening to them. In a world as consistently painful as the lands between, a figure who offers relief from awareness is not a villain and not quite a saviour. She's something more specific and more gentle than either. She's the person who sits with you while you're in pain and offers you the option of not being conscious of it for a while. The fact that Miquella and St. Trina are connected in the lore, that they may be the same being expressing itself differently across different registers of existence, gives everything about Miquella a different quality when you return to it. Miquella, who took in the rejected and the cursed and the sick. Miquella, who tried to grow a tree that would heal his sister. Miquella, who went to sleep in a cocoon to sustain that tree and was taken while sleeping. If Miquella is also Trina, then the mercy he extended to everyone around him was the same mercy Trina extends through sleep. The mercy of someone who knows what it is to need relief from your own existence and chooses to offer that relief to others rather than keeping it for themselves. The bestial sanctum in Caelid, reachable early in the game through a sending gate near the third church of Marika, is one of the most disorienting locations to arrive at unexpectedly. The gate deposits you in the far northeast of the map, in a region of devastated red landscape, with a massive structure in front of you and a black blade kindred waiting outside it. If you somehow survive the kindred and enter the sanctum, you find Gurranq, the beast clergyman, a large feral creature who exchanges deathroot for incantations, and who becomes progressively more agitated as you bring him more of the substance he both craves and is clearly harmed by. Gurranq's questline, if it can be called that, is one of the most stripped down in the game. You bring him a thing, he gives you something. He tries to attack you at a certain point, and then recovers himself and apologizes. The apologizing is the detail worth sitting with. He attacks you because the deathroot pushed him past a threshold, and when he comes back to himself, he apologizes, because whatever he is underneath the feral hunger is someone who understands that attacking you was wrong and is sorry for it. He has a moral framework. He experiences shame. He is living inside a compulsion he didn't choose, and he's managing it as best he can, and occasionally failing and being sorry when he does. What Gurranq is, the lore reveals slowly, and then all at once late in the game, in a context that reframes everything about him, is someone for whom appetite and purpose have become inextricably tangled, someone who consumes something destructive, because consuming it is the only way to keep it from spreading further. He is containing the death he eats. He is doing something terrible to himself in service of something necessary. The shame he feels when the containing slips and he acts against his own values is the shame of someone who knows what they're doing, and knows why, and hasn't found a way to make the two things fit together cleanly. The cookbook items, scattered throughout the lands between and sold by various merchants, expand your crafting options in ways that are mechanically useful and lore-rich in ways most players ignore. Each cookbook comes from a specific tradition, a specific group of people with specific needs and specific knowledge, and the items they allow you to craft reflect the lives of the people who developed them. The Missionary's Cookbook produces items oriented around survival in hostile territory, around maintaining a presence in places that don't want you there. The Nomadic Warrior's Cookbook produces weapons and tools calibrated for people who are always moving, who can't afford to be burdened by anything they can't carry. The Armorer's Cookbook is the one worth spending time with. It produces items oriented around defense and repair, around maintaining the integrity of things that are under sustained attack. But the items it produces also include certain substances used in burial rites, which is not what you'd expect from a military tradition. The Armorer's knowledge includes how to make things that protect the living and how to properly treat the dead. These were understood as the same competency, both forms of respect for the body and its significance, both expressions of a culture that understood that how you treat what's vulnerable says something essential about what you value. There are dogs in the lands between. Not wolves, not the supernatural beast enemies, but ordinary dogs, or what were once ordinary dogs that appear in certain settlements and ruins in the company of human enemies. They've been with people long enough that they fight alongside them, responding to the same threats, moving through the same spaces. They're not notable enemies. They're annoying because they're fast and low to the ground, and easy to lose track of. Most players kill them without thinking about it, the way you kill everything, because the game requires passage through their territory. What they represent, in the context of the world they inhabit, is domestication's persistence through catastrophe. These are not wild animals that moved into human spaces. They were companions that stayed when everything else changed, that continued to orient themselves around human presence even when human presence became something monstrous and hollow. They're still there, still protecting, still responding to threats to their people with everything they have, in a world where their people have been so thoroughly transformed that the protection is barely distinguishable from the threat. They follow. That's what they were shaped to do over generations by the relationship between their kind and ours. They follow, and the world ended, and they're still following. The very last item description in the game, if you read them in the order the game's internal file structure suggests they were written, belongs to a piece of armor so late in the acquisition chain that most players never see it. The description is 4 sentences. 3 of them are lore. The 4th is this: some things are made to outlast the hands that made them. Whether that sentence is about the armor, or about the lands between, or about something else entirely, is not specified. It doesn't need to be. You said, continue 2126. Claude responded, the finger maiden robes, worn by Hyetta, and by the maidens connected to the 2 fingers system of guidance, have a specific detail in their texture that play the finger maiden robes worn by Hyetta and by the maidens connected to the 2 fingers system of guidance have a specific detail in their texture that players who've examined the model closely have noted and not fully explained. The fabric has a pattern woven into it that isn't visible at normal viewing distance. It requires getting close enough to the model that the camera becomes uncomfortable. Closer than the game usually asks you to look at anything. The pattern, when visible, is not decorative, it's instructional. It shows, in a visual language that appears nowhere else in the game's readable iconography, a series of gestures, positions of the hands, attitudes of the body, things a person would do or be asked to do, in the context of a specific kind of service. The maidens were trained. The robes contained the training. Whoever wore them was walking around with the record of what was asked of them woven into the fabric against their skin, and the fact that the pattern is only visible up close means it was not meant for observers. It was meant for the wearer, or for whoever stood close enough to the wearer to need to know what the wearer had been taught. The intimacy of that is not accidental. The robes are a document worn as clothing, a contract that touched the body, and the body that wore them understood what it had agreed to in a way that didn't require the agreement to be spoken aloud. The Radagon iconography that appears throughout the game, the red-haired figure depicted in mosaics and statues, and the stained glass of the Erdtree Sanctuary, is always shown in motion. Every depiction of Radagon catches him mid-stride, mid-reach, mid-turn, as if the artists who rendered him could not bring themselves to show him still. The Golden Order's other major figures are shown in attitudes of repose, of authority, of settled power. Radagon is always moving. He's always in the middle of going somewhere or doing something, and the something he is in the middle of doing is never quite resolved by the image. This is either a stylistic choice reflecting his nature as a figure of action and martial capability, or it's a record of psychological truth rendered in visual terms, the portrait of someone who could not be still, who was always moving toward or away from something, whose relationship with rest was so compromised that the artists who knew him couldn't imagine him any other way. He was Marika's second husband, and also, the game eventually reveals, the same being as Marika, a self that split into two under the pressure of something the game only obliquely describes. Two people who were one person, one of whom could sit still and one of whom could not, one of whom became the vessel of the Elden Ring and one of whom spent his existence trying to repair it. The motion in every image of Radagon is the motion of someone trying to fix something that can't be fixed, captured mid-attempt, forever. The weapons in Elden Ring have weights that affect how your character moves and how quickly they can act, which is a standard game mechanic. What's less standard is that the weight values, when examined across the full catalogue of weapons, tell a story about what the people who made them understood about the relationship between a weapon and the body that carries it. The lightest weapons are not always the smallest, the heaviest are not always the largest. The weight seems to reflect something about the weapon's relationship to its user, about how much of the carrier's presence the weapon demands, about whether it moves with you or whether you move around it. The grafted blade greatsword, one of the heaviest weapons in the game, is made from many swords fused together, the blades of defeated enemies incorporated into a single, overwhelming mass. Its weight is not just physical. Every sword in its construction was a weapon someone else carried, someone else's choice of how to move through the world. And all of those choices have been compacted into something that now requires the carrier to reorganize their entire relationship with movement around its demands. You don't wield the grafted blade greatsword. You accommodate it. You build your character around its requirements, the way Godric built his castle around the ruins of something he couldn't restore. There is a woman in the Round Table Hold who appears only after a specific point in the main quest and who stands near the edge of the balcony, overlooking the lower floor, looking down at nothing in particular. She doesn't have a name displayed when you approach her. She has dialogue, brief and elliptical, that suggests she arrived recently from somewhere that no longer exists. She doesn't offer a quest. She doesn't sell anything. She's just there, looking at the lower floor, with the expression of someone who is trying to decide whether the place they've arrived at is safe enough to stay in. Her armour is from a region of the lands between that the game establishes as having been destroyed before the events of the game begin. Not devastated, not occupied, not changed, but gone in a way that left no ruins behind. She's wearing the clothing of a place that shouldn't have left survivors, and she's standing in the Round Table Hold, looking at the lower floor. And if you return to her after completing certain late-game events, Her dialogue has changed in a way that suggests she knows what you've done and has decided, on the basis of it, that the place is safe enough to stay in. She has been making a judgment this whole time. You are part of the evidence. The way the game handles your death deserves more attention than it usually receives as a design element distinct from its lore implications. When you die in the lands between, you don't reload from a save. You return. The distinction is precise and intentional. Everything that happened still happened. Every enemy you killed before you died is still dead. Every door you opened is still open. The world did not reset. Only you reset, back to the last site of grace. And the runes you were carrying are left where you fell. A small glowing marker on the ground, showing you where your most recent self ended. The marker is not your body. Your body is fine. You're standing at the site of grace intact. The marker is the runes, the accumulated experience and wealth that was on you when you fell, and it will wait there for you to return and recover it, or it will be lost when you die again before reaching it. The runes don't represent your life. They represent what you had gathered. The game distinguishes very precisely between what you are and what you have accumulated, between the self that persists and the resources that don't, and it makes that distinction concrete and consequential, and occasionally devastating when you die on the way back to your previous death marker and watch the original marker disappear. In lore terms, the return from death is the fundamental characteristic of the Tarnished, the thing that separates you from every other being in the lands between. Everyone else dies finally, you return. The game never fully resolves whether this is a gift or a sentence. The characters who know about it react to it differently. Some with envy, and some with something that looks uncomfortable, close to pity. You are unkillable in the sense that matters to the story, and you are killed constantly in the sense that matters to the experience of playing. And the gap between those two facts is where most of the game's emotional meaning lives. The sealed tunnel in the Altus Plateau, a dungeon that most players find by accident while exploring the cliff faces, contains a population of workers who are mining something that the dungeon's item drops identify as smithing stones of unusually high quality. The tunnel is old, much older than the structures above it, and the techniques being used to extract the stones are ancient enough that they predate most recorded history in the lands between. The workers doing the extraction are not human. They're not demi-human either, in the sense of the creatures who appear in camps across the surface. They're something in between, or something that was once one and became the other through long enough isolation that the distinction no longer maps cleanly onto them. They have tools, they have a method, they have, in the deepest part of the tunnel where a boss guards the most significant concentration of stones, a shrine of some kind, a space that was clearly not constructed for mining purposes, but that the miners have maintained alongside their work, keeping the two activities separate in a way that suggests they understand the difference between what sustains the body and what sustains something else. They are people who work and who also worship, in a space that has forgotten them so completely that when you arrive to take what they've been producing, you are the first visitor they've had in longer than either of you could calculate. You kill them, or you don't. You take the stones either way. The shrine remains after you leave, maintained by no one, in a tunnel that will eventually collapse or be forgotten again, holding whatever it was built to hold for as long as it can. Dialos, the nobleman you meet early in the game who is searching for his missing servant Lanya, is one of the characters whose questline players most often abandon mid-completion because the steps are spread far apart and the rewards are not obviously significant. He's charming in the specific way of someone who was raised to be charming, who uses warmth as a social tool without being insincere about it, who genuinely cares about the people around him in a way that his class background has not quite managed to educate out of him. He's looking for Lanya. He's worried. The worry is real. Lanya is dead when you find her, killed by the very faction that Diallo subsequently joins because he's trying to make sense of her death, and the faction offers him a framework for doing that. The framework is wrong, or at least inadequate, and watching Diallos move through his questline is watching someone choose meaning over accuracy, because the accuracy is unbearable, and the meaning at least gives him somewhere to stand. By the end of his story, he has done something significant and damaging, and also genuinely costly to himself, in a way that suggests he understood, at some level, what he was trading. He found a way to matter in a world that was not organised around people like him mattering. Whether it was worth the cost is not a question. The game answers on his behalf. The item you receive at the end of his questline, the Newman's rune held by his final form, has a description so brief it barely registers. It says only that it carries the ambitions of one who lived and died by his own rules. He did. In a game full of people who were shaped entirely by forces outside themselves, who were created for purposes, or cursed from birth, or manipulated into destinies they didn't choose, Diallos made choices. They were bad choices, informed by grief and class and a desperate need to believe that something he did could matter. They were his. The 4 belfries in Liurnia, 4 towers on a hillside, each containing an imp seal and a waygate, are one of the more mysterious optional locations in the game. 3 of the waygates lead to brief glimpses of significant locations: Fara Mazula, the Nokron crater, the Erdtree's interior. The 4th waygate leads nowhere. It doesn't activate. The seal can be broken, the gate stands open, and there is simply nothing on the other side. Or rather, there is the suggestion of something that has been removed, a destination that the gate was built to reach that no longer exists. The tower with the inactive gate is the oldest of the 4. The stonework is more weathered, the imp statue more eroded, the surrounding ground more sunken with age. This gate was built first, to reach something that the other gates were built after, in places chosen because they were significant. What that first destination was, the game does not say. It was important enough to build a gate to, and it is gone completely enough, that the gate now opens onto nothing, and the silence on the other side of it has been there long enough that it has its own quality, distinct from the silence of spaces that were never full. You can stand in that gate. You can stand in the threshold of a door to somewhere that no longer exists, and the game will let you stay there as long as you want, looking at the nothing that replaced something, before you decide to turn around and go back to the world that's left. There is a moment in the game, accessible only if you pursue a very specific sequence of optional content in a very specific order, where 2 questlines that appear entirely separate converge in a single location at the same time. Both characters are present. Neither of them acknowledges the other. They're in the same room for reasons that their individual stories entirely explain, reasons that have nothing to do with each other, and the convergence is the kind of coincidence that stops feeling like coincidence when you understand how the lands between works, when you understand that the world has a shape, and the shape brings certain things together because of what they are rather than because anyone arranged for them to meet. The 2 characters don't speak to each other. They don't look at each other. They're each in the middle of their own trajectory, their own grief, their own attempt to resolve something that may not be resolvable. And you are in the room with both of them, knowing both of their stories, holding the context that neither of them has for the other, understanding something about the shape of the world that they can each only see part of. This is what it feels like to have paid attention. Not power, not advantage, not a better outcome necessarily. Just the particular fullness of understanding why you're in a room with 2 people who don't know they're part of the same story. The game gives you that. It gives it to you quietly, without fanfare, as the reward for having followed 2 threads far enough that you were there when they crossed. The lands between has weather. Not just rain, not just the eternal storm of Fara Mazula, but weather in the full sense, systems that move across the landscape, that change the quality of light and the behaviour of certain creatures, and the feeling of standing in an open field looking at the horizon. Fog rolls in from the coast of Liurnia in a way that obscures the ruins differently, at different times of the cycle. The snow in the mountaintops shifts between falling and stillness in patterns that are regular enough to predict if you spend long enough there. The weather doesn't affect gameplay in the ways that weather affects gameplay in other open-world games. It doesn't slow you down or improve your visibility or change the outcome of encounters in mechanical terms. It just changes what the world looks like while you're in it. It changes the mood of the place, the quality of presence, the feeling of being inside a specific moment in a living world rather than traversing a static environment. From software built a weather system whose entire function is atmosphere, whose entire output is the feeling of being somewhere real, and they did this in a game that did not need it, that would have been complete without it, that already had more content than almost any game ever made. They put the weather in because the weather makes it truer, because a world without weather is a world that exists only for you, that has no life independent of your presence in it. The weather happens whether you're watching or not. The fog moves in over Liurnia while you're underground in Siofra, unable to see it, and it will be there when you surface, having done what it does in your absence, because that's what weather in a real place does. You will finish this game, or you won't. You will find most of its secrets, or you will find some of them, or you will miss nearly all of them, and still have an experience that changes something about you. The lands between is not stingy with what it gives. It gives differently depending on how you approach it. More to those who linger, more still to those who read, most of all to those who return after they thought they were finished and find that they weren't, that there was still something waiting in a corner they hadn't looked in, a detail they'd walked past 100 times before seeing. The game does not end when the credits roll. It continues in the way that places you've been continue, in the way that Limgrave is still there when you're not in it, still green and cold and full of ruins and ordinary birds that take off when you get close. It continues in the questions it left open, in the connections you haven't drawn yet. In the item description, you remember suddenly weeks later, that meant something different than you thought. Somewhere in the lands between, right now, the fog is moving in over Liurnia. The mausoleums are walking their slow circuits, bells tolling in a rhythm that almost means something. A scarab is crossing an unmarked grave. A woman in the round table hold is looking at the lower floor, deciding whether this is safe enough to stay in. And somewhere, in a cave with ancient carvings and torches that point inward rather than forward, a message on the ground reads, "Ahead, therefore be aware of surroundings." It was there before you arrived. It will be there after you leave. Someone left it for you, or for someone like you, someone who would wash up on a shore and follow the light and keep looking long after the looking stopped being necessary and became simply what you do, who you are, the particular quality of attention you brought to a world that was built to receive it. The world was built for that, for you, for the version of you that doesn't stop. Keep going.